Israel Keyes was born on January 7th, 1978, in Richmond, Utah. He was the second of 10 children and the eldest son of John Jeffrey and Heidi Keyes. Israel and his siblings were homeschooled, and for a significant portion of their childhood, the children were largely detached from mainstream society. Most of the children did not have social security numbers or birth certificates because the parents rejected government involvement. At the time of his birth, his parents were members of the Mormon Church, but later the family moved toward Christian identity theology. In the Christian identity movement, followers often refer to themselves as the true Israel. They believe they are the literal descendants of the ancient Israelites mentioned in the Bible. Naming their eldest son Israel was a reflection of this worldview. Some of his siblings were also named with the Bible in mind, like his brother Elijah. His parents were sovereign citizens, part of the Ark Church in Washington. There was a heavy overlap between radical religious fundamentalism and a sovereign citizen or ultra-patriotic mindset. That's why they called one of his sisters America. Israel's childhood was characterized by extreme social isolation, primitive living conditions, and a total lack of traditional schooling or medical care. The family lived in a one-room cabin that lacked electricity and running water. For the first 7 years in Washington, they reportedly lived in a tent while his father built the cabin by hand. The family rejected almost all government interference and modern conveniences. Israel later described their lifestyle as being similar to the Amish. As the oldest son, Israel carried significant responsibility. He was expected to help provide for the family by hunting, dressing game, chopping firewood, and working on local farms. His only social circle consisted of his family and a few other families from their local fringe religious community. Notably, they were neighbors and friends with the family of Chevy Kehoe, who was later convicted of a triple murder. His mother strictly prohibited activities she deemed against God, such as learning musical instruments or watching movies with friends. Much of Israel's time was spent in the woods. He was known to hunt anything with a heartbeat and became highly proficient at sitting motionless in the woods for hours. By age 14, Keyes purposefully began to isolate himself. He felt he was different from his peers and became a loner by choice to keep his private thoughts and activities hidden. During his teenage years in Colville, his life was defined by a mix of heavy labor, high-level craftsmanship, and a deep, solitary connection to the outdoors. But despite being a loner, he wasn't entirely antisocial. Records indicate he had a girlfriend during his teens. He was also known to visit the local pool, where he was described as being able to talk to people and blend in when he wanted to. Keyes was exceptionally talented with his hands. By the age of 16, he had already built his own one-room wooden cabin. He parlayed this skill into a job working for a local contractor in Colville named Kelly Harris between 1995 and 1997. He was part of a 7-man crew and built approximately 6 duplex homes per year, stick frame and log homes. Around his mid-teens, Keyes began keeping a journal. In it, he would record daily sins for which he felt shame, often including biblical quotations. As he grew older, he began to rebel. He became a fan of heavy metal, specifically bands like Megadeth and Lacuna Coil, and would often blare this music from his truck. The family moved to Smyrna, Maine in the 1990s, which is in Aroostook County in far northern Maine. They were involved in the maple syrup business, collecting sap for production. They lived on the outskirts of the local Amish settlement, which was the oldest Amish settlement in Maine and described as more progressive than some other Amish communities. Keyes eventually reached a breaking point with his family's lifestyle. After a major ideological fallout with his father, he was essentially forced out, which led him to seek the structure of the U.S. Army at age 20. Israel Keyes enlisted in the U.S. Army on April 22, 1998, under the Delayed Enlistment Program in Albany, New York. Then reported for basic training on July 9, 1998, and served until his honorable discharge on July 8, 2001. His military career provided him with structure and specialized training that heavily influenced his later life and technical skills. He served in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry, which was part of the 25th Infantry Division, where he reached the rank of Specialist E4. His primary role was as a gunner and assistant gunner within a 60mm mortar section. During his 3 years of service, Keyes was stationed at several key domestic and international locations, like Fort Lewis, Washington, his primary duty station for much of his service, Fort Hood, Texas, and Egypt, Sinai Peninsula. From January to June 2000, he was deployed to Egypt as part of a peacekeeping mission. Keyes was noted for being a capable and disciplined soldier. He completed a month-long preliminary course for Army Ranger training, though he did not go on to attend the full Ranger School. He also earned an Air Assault badge. He was awarded the Expert Infantryman badge and a Marksman badge with rifle bar, indicating high proficiency with firearms, and he received the Army Achievement Medal for his meritorious service as a gunner, as well as the Army Service Ribbon. He was generally described as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. He followed orders and passed his tests without drawing negative attention to himself. He reportedly enjoyed listening to heavy metal and hip-hop, specifically Insane Clown Posse, and kept posters of the musical acts in his barracks. While stationed at Fort Lewis, Keyes became romantically involved with a woman named Tammy Hawkins on the Makah Reservation in Washington in 2000. 1 year later, his daughter Lainey was born, and after his honorable discharge from the Army in July 2000, according to his website resume, even if Wikipedia says 2001, he moved in with Tammy and Lainey in Near Bay. He worked for the Makah Tribal Council there from 2001 until 2007. His role with the Makah Tribal Council was as the lead in their brand new Parks and Recreation Department. He built many trails, recreational buildings, and assisted the Public Works Department in times of need or emergency situations. Coordinated the purchase, maintenance, and operation of machinery and equipment, including a pump truck and portable as well as permanent remote toilet facilities. Near Bay is a very small village, and his position with the tribe and the projects that he completed for them gave him an excellent reputation with the locals. This allowed him the unique opportunity to do a wide variety of construction projects for many customers on weekends. Locals remembered him as someone who could fix about anything. It wasn't until he moved to Anchorage in 2007 that he stepped up and started his own formal business, Keyes Construction. He was a perfectionist. Clients described him as professional, punctual, and reliable. When he moved to Anchorage in 2007, the outdoor adventurer persona just fit the local culture perfectly. Everyone else was doing it out there, especially long-distance kayaking and extreme hiking. He started hating religion and would often get into intellectual arguments about it. Coming from the ARC, that white supremacist, ultra-religious commune he grew up in, he viewed religion as a tool for control. By the time he was in Near Bay, and definitely by Anchorage, he was a hardcore, vocal atheist. He wasn't your typical atheist, more like looking for a fight kind of atheist. Basically, he would snap at you if you mentioned faith, bullying you out of your religion, especially when he drank. His go-to was Wild Turkey, a brand of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. It's pretty high proof and has a reputation for being rough or kick you in the teeth strong compared to smoother stuff like Jack Daniels. This is the part that often cracked the perfect image. Dozens of books about murders were found at his residence, both fiction and non-fiction. He read Dean Koontz's thriller Intensity multiple times, identifying with the serial killer character, and studied Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit by FBI profiler John E. Douglas. When asked about Robert Hansen, he said, "Yeah, I know all about him," and continued, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." In both Near Bay and Anchorage, Keyes was known as an incredibly attentive parent. He told his girlfriends that he and his daughter were a package deal. If a partner didn't want to help watch her or didn't get along with her, he would end the relationship. He was the guy going to parent-teacher conferences and braiding her hair. One co-worker even used the word doting to describe how he acted around her. I recently found a street view picture of him and his daughter near his truck. I know everyone else believes it was a simple facade, but he was a psychopath and was unable to feel love, but I strongly believe he genuinely loved her. Even if my intent is respectful and the framing is balanced, Lainey, now 24, still has to live with people discussing her childhood with her father. That's unavoidable, given the public nature of the case, but it's worth being aware of. And I wasn't sure how to approach this. She loved her dad. He was a good father to her by all accounts. Then she found out the truth at age 10, and her entire world collapsed. Every video about him, even sympathetic ones showing he was human, a good dad, had hobbies, is still about her father, the serial killer. That's her trauma being discussed, and actively showing footage of her, even blurred from Street View, feels different. Israel Keyes died in custody on December 1st, 2012, while awaiting trial in Anchorage. He was 34 years old, and the last deal he made with the FBI was the following. Execution within a year. He wanted to be executed quickly, not sit on death row for decades. No media publicity. He was terrified of negative attention toward his daughter and family. He wanted to avoid becoming a famous serial killer. Details kept confidential. He didn't want specifics released that would hurt his family. He initially cooperated to some extent, confessing to some crimes and providing information. But he largely stopped cooperating after his identity was discussed in the media. Once his name got out publicly, he felt the deal was broken. Once he was arrested in Texas in March 2012 and extradited to Alaska, his name became public through court records, law enforcement briefings, or media investigations. By the time he was in custody in Alaska, the media had his identity and were reporting on the case. The FBI likely justify it as necessary for the investigation. Getting his name out could help identify victims, get tips, solve cold cases. But from Keyes' perspective, they promised confidentiality to protect his family, especially his daughter, and then broke that promise. So cooperation ended, he stopped talking, tried to escape and got tased, then committed self-checkout, taking his secrets with him. All those unsolved cases and unidentified victims are the result of law enforcement breaking the deal. Whether that breach was intentional, necessary for the investigation, or just inevitable once he was in the system. According to FBI, in the US, you cross paths with a serial killer about 36 times in your lifetime. It can be the guy at the bar talking about religion, the dad of the little girl your son called friend, the contractor that built your house, or the funny guy in the army you used to hang out with. You never know, because they have a human side, just like you. Richard Trenton Chase, full name Anthony Richard Trenton Chase, Toomer, was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. He was the firstborn child of Beatrice Chase and Richard Chase Sr. His sister, Pamela Chase, was 4 years younger than him. Before he reached the age of 5, the family moved to Sacramento, California, and Richard Sr. saw this as a fresh start for the family. The new house was on the periphery of suburbia, with easy access to the woods outside of town. The family was considered to be the typical 1950 dysfunctional family in which a lot of arguing and some physical abuse were present. But it was not severe enough to be classified as out of the norm of the culture of that time. Chase was raised in a strict household and often beaten by his father, and Beatrice was known to be a mentally unstable woman who consulted psychologists and psychiatrists on numerous occasions. One group of mental health care professionals labeled her as the classic mother from whom a schizophrenic child would result, highly aggressive, hostile, and provocative. Beatrice often accused Richard Sr. of infidelity, of poisoning her, and of using drugs. In an interview with Richard Sr., he said that these accusations and other loud arguments had to have been overheard by his kids. Before he was 10, Chase's teachers and acquaintances thought of him as a sweet and cooperative boy. Apart from consistently wetting the bed, he displayed no other behavioral problems, and the bedwetting also ceased soon after his 8th birthday. He played Little League Baseball for 4 consecutive years and was a Cub Scout. He also had many friends, was well thought of at school, and over 60 children attended one of his birthday parties. Then, around 1958, cats began disappearing from the neighborhood. Beatrice took a visiting neighbor to the backyard and pointed to some flower boxes, saying her son had buried a cat there. The neighbor later recalled that quite a few cats had gone missing from the area at the time. Richard also killed dogs, birds, and rabbits, later moving on to hunting anything he could catch in the woods, bringing the carcasses back to the garden, and burying them when done. Around the same time, the fire settings began. He obsessively collected and hoarded matchbooks and set small fires in the woods as part of sadistic play. He set fire to a neighbor's garage because he didn't like the loud music they played. His father administered a severe beating after the garage fire. The fire setting was described as an emotional response to his accumulated rage. The full McDonald triad was established: bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals, all present by age 10. The McDonald triad was considered an early warning sign for violent behavior in adulthood, although it is now partially debunked, in a sense that 2 of the 3 are not considered factors anymore, just guidelines into some troubled child that needs assistance. But the animal cruelty is still considered a sign of violent behavior in adulthood. None of these signs were acted upon by family, school, or authorities. Around 1962, financial problems reached a breaking point, and the family lost their house, moving back into a small apartment similar to the one Richard had lived in as a toddler. The loss of space, woods, and solitude was a significant blow to Richard's coping mechanisms, and his parents' fighting intensified in the confined space. In 1964, Chase entered 9th grade at Mira Loma High School in Sacramento, founded in 1960, considered one of the more reputable public high schools in Sacramento. Known to his peers as Rick, he was described as neat, well-groomed, and well-mannered. He had many friends, both male and female, moved freely between social groups, was popular with girls, and able to blend in and hold conversations easily. But late that same year, his parents separated. Richard and Pamela were sent to stay with relatives in Los Angeles, but the separation was temporary. The family reunited and returned to Sacramento to finish the school year. During the LA stay, Richard began picking up health anxieties, convinced his heart was skipping beats. Between 1964 and 1965, he dated several girls, two of whom he considered more serious than the rest. Both girls were about 2 years younger than him, and both relationships ended when Chase attempted intercourse but was unable to maintain an erection. In 1965, he began dating a girl who later used the pseudonym Libby Christopher in interviews. Same result. The inability to achieve an erection led to their split in 1966. The dysfunction weighed heavily on him, and he admitted to a friend it affected him deeply. His sophomore year, 1965, was when his behavior began to deteriorate. He became rebellious and defiant, his ambition collapsed, and his room was in a state of constant disarray. He began experimenting with marijuana and LSD in extremely heavy doses, started hanging around the acid head crowd, and also began drinking alcohol heavily alongside his drug use. His appearance deteriorated, and he became increasingly disheveled. That same year he was arrested for possession of marijuana in quantities that suggested dealing. It was simply his personal supply. The juvenile court sentenced him to weekend community cleanup work. He was furious at his father for refusing to hire a lawyer to defend him, and the last of his faith in his father eroded in the courtroom. Also in 1965, he got drunk enough at a party to run down the street shouting incoherently. A friend chased him down. He sobered up and spent the night confessing his erectile dysfunction to his friend at length. Both feigned amnesia about it the next day. But the conversation gave Chase the confidence to seek a doctor. In 1966, he was caught stealing a bottle of whiskey from a neighbor's apartment. His father again let the police handle it without intervening. Chase received a warning. His reputation among neighbors was damaged, and he showed no embarrassment or remorse about the theft. In 1968, Chase graduated from Mira Loma High School with C's, D's, and F's. His IQ was tested at 95, normal intelligence. His academic career was described as a growing defiance of authority that turned into open rebellion. That December, at age 18, he consulted a psychiatrist specializing in adolescent problems. He complained about his erectile dysfunction and failed attempts at intercourse, and also shared fears about his emotional stability and his family's problems. The psychiatrist told him repressed anger was the most common cause of male impotence, and suspected a possible underlying mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, but did not recommend hospitalization at that time. Richard never returned for a follow-up. Between 1968 and 1971, Chase enrolled at American River College in Sacramento, oscillating between various courses without taking them seriously. His grades were below average, his attendance erratic, and he eventually dropped out. His first job, typing and phone answering for Retailers Credit Association in 1969, was the only sustained job he ever held. He found other odd jobs in Sacramento over the next few years, but none of them lasted long. His appearance continued to deteriorate, his hair grew, and he became increasingly scruffy. His mother refused to notice, telling friends he looked no different from any other youth of his generation. In early 1971, Chase moved into an apartment on Annandale Lane with two female roommates, Sid Evans DeMarchi and Rachel Statham, who had met him sitting on their lawn in February 1971, and let him move in. His parents gave him $50 a month toward rent. His roommates described him as a slob. He rarely bathed, never washed his clothes, and his behavior was generally repulsive. He walked out of his room naked and began unintelligible conversations with visiting guests. He was found lying on the floor, moaning at a party, unable to speak intelligibly. He leaned out a window and waved a gun at strangers on the street. He boarded up his bedroom door, knocked a hole in the closet wall, and nailed it shut from the inside, telling people someone was sneaking up on him. He was using marijuana daily plus barbiturates and amphetamines. DeMarchi and Statham moved out. Statham's brother tried to move in with his rock band, but Chase kept barging in to play congas. They also eventually moved out. Left alone and unable to afford the rent, his parents had to retrieve him. In 1971, Chase dropped out of college and stopped working. His behavior became increasingly irrational. He began cutting out photos of human organs from medical books and pasting them over his bedroom walls, trying to understand what was wrong with him. His physical delusions were intensifying. He believed his stomach was upside down and that his heart frequently stopped beating. In 1972, he drove alone to Utah on a road trip funded by his mother, and was arrested for driving under the influence. His father drove to bail him out. On return, Chase told his parents he had been gassed in jail and wanted to sue the police. His father talked him out of it. After being kicked out of his father's residence, he would stand outside and stare blankly at the property for extended periods of time. In June 1972, his parents finalized their divorce after a decade of efforts to hold the marriage together. Chase alternated between his mother's and father's residences. His father did not believe Richard's problems were mental illness. He attributed them to laziness and misguided values. Chase frequently fought with his mother, believing she was poisoning him, mirroring her own delusions about his father. Late in 1972, Richard grabbed the phone and hit his mother over the head with it during an argument. She called the police, but did not press charges. Between 1972 and 1973, Chase had 2 stints living with his paternal grandmother in Los Angeles. During his first stay, he worked as a bus driver for his uncle, transporting mentally disabled children. He was fired for never cleaning the bus and letting it run low on oil. He spent days in bed, roamed the house at night, and became convinced someone was entering through a window. His grandmother found him standing on his head in the corner of his room. He said he was trying to get blood to run back down to his head. During his second stay, he found a job at a paint store and was fired within 2 weeks. His grandmother noted that both his mental state and physical appearance had deteriorated badly during that second stay. In May 1973, he moved in with his grandmother once more to help his uncle and her run a school for developmentally challenged children, driving the bus. He was nervous and agitated constantly, complained of heart and stomach discomfort, and flatly refused to keep his hands or clothes clean. His behavior was described by relatives as nothing rational. The arrangement lasted only a few weeks before he was sent home. In April 1973, Chase attended a small gathering at an acquaintance's apartment, drinking from a bottle wrapped in a paper bag. 2 men left their female friend alone with him. He began fondling her and would not stop when asked. When the men returned and ordered him to leave, he screamed that no one had the right to tell him what to do. After an hour of arguing, he left. then immediately returned claiming to look for cigarettes. He started shoving one of the men, and a .22 caliber gun fell from his pocket during the struggle. The police came, and his father bailed him out again. Returning to Sacramento for good in the summer of 1973, Chase resumed cutting out organ photos and pasting them all over his bedroom. He called an ambulance claiming cardiac arrest. The paramedics refused to take him when they found no emergency. He went to his mother begging for help. She arranged 2 doctors. He was dissatisfied with both. He went to Dr. Donald Ansel on his own. Ansel found nothing physically wrong and concluded Chase had a psychiatric disturbance of major proportion. That same year, Chase killed one of his own cats after seeing a television story about a cat receiving high-quality medical treatment. He was infuriated that the cat received care he believed he deserved. On December 1st, 1973, Chase walked into the emergency room of American River Hospital, complaining he couldn't breathe, that his blood had stopped flowing, that he was suffering cardiac arrest, and that his pulmonary artery had been stolen. Dr. Irwin Lyons described him as tense, nervous, and wild-eyed, filthy, disheveled, deteriorated, and foul-smelling. No physical complications were found, and he was referred to psychiatry. He was diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia, though drug-induced psychosis could not be ruled out given his years of heavy use. Admitted for 72-hour observation, he denied all hallucinations and delusions and insisted he knew as much about medicine as his doctors. He walked out without permission. His mother returned him. He walked out again a few days later. Beatrice told the doctors she would handle things at home. The psychiatrist said he was not a danger to himself or others. Throughout 1974, he was brought to multiple physicians with a new physical complaint each visit. Brain scans, ECGs, thyroid tests. All normal. In 1975, at age 25, Chase applied for and received Social Security and welfare. The examining physician found him coherent with intact memory and his judgment apparently not impaired. He was dangerously underweight, 145 pounds at 5 feet 11 inches. The physician described him as at best unkempt looking. He was approved for welfare on the basis that he was an impossible job candidate and received $246 a month. This new income gave him independence from his parents for the first time. For a time he improved, exercising and gaining weight over the next 5 months. But then the psychosis returned. He started accusing his mother of poisoning him, throwing prepared meals on the floor, and cooking for himself. He refused to drink from open milk cartons and once flavored milk with soap, believing it tasted strange. He placed oranges on his head, believing his brain would absorb vitamin C through his skull. He believed his cranial bones had separated and were moving inside his head, and he shaved his head to observe the movement. He read a cardiac article and demanded his mother buy him an oxygen tent. She refused. The argument ended with him knocking her tooth out and leaving her unconscious on the kitchen floor. He frequently conversed with an imaginary person sending him messages via telepathy, and on 2 occasions accused Beatrice of controlling his mind. His father located an apartment on Cannon Street and arranged the move after Chase became dangerous at his mother's house. Chase was warned that drug use would result in his payments being cut. He began riding his bicycle to a nearby rabbit farm, buying rabbits and butchering them at home. His parents thought he was doing well and had no idea about the rabbits. The rabbit killings were described as restoring his sense of control, and even his libido. Death and sexual arousal had become inextricably linked in his mind. He began draining and drinking rabbit blood and eventually progressed to injecting it. On April 26, 1976, his father found him at the apartment, pale and barely dressed, in only his shorts, the door wide open. Chase said he had bought a bad rabbit and thought he had food poisoning. He had in fact injected himself with the rabbit's blood. His father drove him to Sacramento Community Clinic. Chase told the doctors he had eaten a rabbit that had eaten battery acid, which seeped through his stomach walls into his flesh, and insisted his blood pressure was 0. The physical examination revealed septicemia, blood poisoning from the injection. He demanded to be moved in the ward because he was afraid of catching a disease from other patients. His parents informed the doctors about years of drug use, marijuana, LSD, narcotics. He was diagnosed as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia with somatic delusions and transferred to the psychiatric unit at American River Hospital. He ran away 2 days later. His father returned him the following day. He was then transferred to Beverly Manor, a psychiatric facility in Carmichael, just outside Sacramento. Conservatorship proceedings began on May 3, 1976. His parents were appointed as legal conservators on June 2nd. Chase was told by the hospital that if he left, he would be returned by police or sheriff. He ran away 2 days later anyway, and his father returned him. At Beverly Manor, staff and patients quickly gave him the nickname Dracula. He barely spoke, and when he did it was exclusively about animals and blood. He said that killing and butchering rabbits was easy because they looked like mechanical toys. He lured birds to his window with bread crusts, caught them with his bare hands, twisted off their heads, and drank the blood directly from the neck. Nurses found him crouching outside, with fresh blood on his face on multiple occasions. Beheaded birds piled up outside his bedroom window. 2 nurses quit during his stay because they were frightened of him. He ranted about blood being essential to the transfer of life energy between bodies. His somatic delusions continued. Missing arteries, a shrinking heart, blood turning to powder. On September 29, 1976, Chase was discharged from Beverly Manor at his mother's direction. Not all staff agreed with the decision. The discharge summary stated he had developed good social skills, a realistic view of his problems, and clearer thinking. Beatrice collected him and arranged for his Social Security grant of $246 a month to go directly to the landlord of the Watt Avenue complex. Groceries and utilities were paid from her own pocket. Richard Sr. was not informed that his son had been released from psychiatric care. He would have objected. Chase was placed in apartment number 12 at the Watt Avenue complex in Sacramento. For a while he kept his doctor's appointments with no complaints, but after 2 to 3 months he began complaining of headaches caused by a blood clot in his head. A computerized brain scan showed nothing neurologically wrong. Beatrice quietly began reducing his medication doses without consulting his doctors. Her reasoning: he was too sedated, too easy to manage. She wanted her son back to his normal self. Withdrawal symptoms followed. Voices and paranoia began returning. When the time came for the conservatorship to be renewed in court in 1977, Beatrice, believing he had made a full recovery, allowed it to lapse. Chase now had legal control over his own life again, and was off his medication. Over $1,000 in back Social Security payments had accrued. He used the funds to travel, taking a Greyhound bus to Washington State, spending 2 weeks there, then going on to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, where he bought a silver 1966 Ford Ranchero for all his remaining cash. He returned to Sacramento and stayed briefly with Beatrice. During that stay, he slapped and knocked his mother to the floor during an argument. then moved back into the Watt Avenue complex, this time apartment number 15. What followed was a sharp escalation. He ripped open Beatrice's cat in front of her and smeared its blood over his face. He mutilated her German Shepherd dog, left it alive but ruined. It had to be put down. He bought and stole dogs and puppies from the neighborhood to dismember and consume. He preyed on neighborhood cats and dogs and called the owners of missing animals to gloat and describe how their pet had died. Signs were posted for missing dogs everywhere, and police began investigating, suspecting a wild animal. He became fascinated with the hillside strangler killings in Los Angeles and attempted to contact the killers, believing they were fighting the same Nazi conspiracy targeting him. He began hoarding hunting rifles and pistols, kept mostly in his car. New delusions took hold. He believed he had been reincarnated as a Jesse James gang member, that a Nazi crime syndicate from high school was after him with a soap dish that would turn his blood to powder, and that UFOs were circling overhead. On August 3, 1977, officers from the Bureau of Indian Affairs found his Ford Ranchero parked near Pyramid Lake Reservation in Nevada. Inside were 2 rifles, a .30-30 Marlin and a .22 semi-automatic, both stained with blood. Also inside, a pile of men's clothing, bloody tennis shoes, and a white plastic bucket containing a raw liver sitting in a pool of fresh blood. The officers spotted a naked figure on a rock approximately 1 mile away. He bolted. They caught him. Blood had been smeared over his entire naked body and face. He identified himself as Richard Trenton Chase, age 27, of Sacramento, California. When asked where the blood came from, he replied in a soft, high-pitched voice, "It's seeping from me." He had killed a cow on a nearby farm and drained its blood, spending the night by the lake smearing blood and liver over his body. Laboratory tests confirmed the blood and liver were bovine. All charges were dropped, and he was released. Back in Sacramento, entirely off medication, conservatorship gone, and living alone in apartment number 15 at the Watt Avenue complex, his weapons were still partially impounded by the Nevada police pending documentation. On December 2, 1977, he purchased a new semi-automatic .22 pistol for cash and had to wait for his credentials to be verified before taking it home. He began driving circuits of Sacramento neighborhoods, trying doorknobs and watching houses. His neighbor, Dawn Larson, reported him crowding her on a stairwell and reaching toward her chest before being interrupted. An old school acquaintance, Nancy Holden, saw him wandering aimlessly and stopped to talk. She refused to give him a lift and left with a strong feeling something was very wrong with him. Disorientated, scared, confused and degraded, Richard Trenton Chase was now fighting his demons alone. That didn't go well. But this video is not about what he was about to do next. We already covered that story in another video. You can watch it by clicking on this video. Go on, click on it. I drew an arrow pointing to it. So you have to now. But go lock your door first. You never know who else is turning knobs in your neighborhood. On December 11, 1936, at Northern Liberties Hospital in Philadelphia, Judith Brenner gave birth to a healthy 9-pound boy. She was not quite 21. The father, Joseph Lee Brenner Jr., had stopped seeing her when she told him she was pregnant. Her husband, James, was not the father. She was afraid that if she acknowledged the boy, James would take custody of her legitimate daughter, Muriel. She named the baby Joseph. For 3 weeks, Judith breastfed him at a friend's house, cooed at him, sang to him, touched him lovingly. She knew he wouldn't have it much longer. Then she went back to work and put him in a private boarding home, visiting once a week to pay his $5 board. She couldn't keep up with the payments. At 3 months and 9 days old, Joseph left the boarding home for St. Vincent's, a Catholic orphanage on the corner of a street he'd remember only as a place with steep high steps and swinging doors and long dim hallways where nuns moved silently in black habits like dark gliding birds. On his birth certificate he was Joseph, son of James. At the orphanage he was baby boy Brenner. Judith went back and forth for over a year, refusing placement, then agreeing, then refusing to pay his board, then paying a small amount. In December 1937, she put him on the possible adoption list. On October 15, 1938, a representative from the Catholic Children's Bureau called to say that a very nice family selected him. Stephen and Anna Kallinger were Catholic immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who had built a shoe repair business at 2723 North Front Street, in the Kensington section of Philadelphia. It was a 2-story red brick row house where the window shades were always down and the door to the living quarters always closed. Stephen came from Hungary in 1921. And Anna came from a village in Austria in 1925. They married in 1926, but Stephen was sterile. Their family doctor had urged them to adopt, but they kept putting it off. Stephen's fear of growing old without an heir, and Anna's fear of not having someone to lean on in her old age, eventually brought them to St. Vincent's. When they appeared over the crib, Stephen wanted the boy immediately. The jet black hair matched his own. Anna wanted a girl, and she would later tell Joseph that because he wasn't one, he'd been a disappointment from the start. Joseph arrived at the Kallinger home on October 25, 1938, 22 months old. No child had ever lived in that house before him. After his arrival, no child was ever allowed in to play with him. The Kallingers didn't kiss him, stroke him, or play with him. They touched him only to hit him or to hold his hand walking to school. Anna took him to and from school until he was 13. They called him Joseph. When he annoyed them, they called him Dummkopf. They told him and everyone else that they had rescued him from an orphanage and that he'd have to pay them back. Didn't he have a good room, good clothes? Better than the other kids. The nuns at St. Boniface asked for his hand-me-downs for the poor children. The threat they kept for control was always the same. We'll send you back where we found you. Stephen waved the knife with the green handle, the lip knife he used to cut leather soles, and repeated it. The threat came without warning. It came when he didn't eat his spinach. It came when he forgot to take off his rubbers at the door. It came when he asked what a word meant. He never knew when it was coming. On September 1st, 1943, 6-year-old Joseph came home from St. Mary's Hospital, where he'd spent 16 days recovering from a hernia operation. Anna picked him up without saying a word the entire taxi ride back. Stephen had an employee named Caesar manage the store and was waiting inside. He placed Joseph's maple kiddie chair directly under the chandelier and told him to sit down. Anna said Dr. Daly had done something to Joseph in the hospital besides fix the hernia. Stephen bent down close to Joseph's ear and said quietly that Dr. Daly had also fixed his little bird. In the Kallinger home, bird was the word for penis. When Joseph asked what was wrong with his little bird, Anna told him a demon had lived there before the operation. The demon made it hard and made boys do bad things, she said, and their souls went to the devil. Dr. Daly had driven the demon out. His bird would never grow big. It would always stay small, 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 small. She repeated the word 5 times. Demons can't live in birds that don't grow big. He'd be a good boy forever. He'd never get a girl in trouble. Not now, not when he was a man. Stephen and Anna knew Dr. Daly did nothing to the boy's genitals. The doctor performed only the hernia operation. They fabricated the entire story. They'd overreacted to 3 incidents involving Joseph before the operation, one of them not sexual at all, and decided they needed to prevent their adopted son from ever having a sex life. Months earlier, Joseph asked a neighbor boy what the word fuck meant, and Stephen dragged him inside and flogged him with leather strips. 2 weeks later, Anna caught him trying to pull a little girl's panties down in an alley. 2 weeks before the operation, a red-headed girl kicked Joseph while he was climbing a fence. He vomited and came home pale and dirty, and Anna was certain he'd done something bad to her. That evening, walking upstairs to his room, Joseph stopped at the rectangular mirror on the staircase wall. He recalls he moved his fingertips along the cool glass the way he always did, thinking about the other world, silent and clear, on the other side. He saw, floating in the middle of the living room, reflected in the glass, a large lip knife, blade and handle vertical, with his penis hanging from the tip of the blade. He brought his hand to his crotch, and the image vanished. Joseph's childhood with the Kallingers fell into 2 parts, before and after the hernia operation. Before, he compensated through fantasy. The butterflies at their country cottage in Neshaminy, Bucks County, which he believed were his real family. The spirits he communed with at the Springhouse Well, 150 feet from the cottage. An imaginary companion he called Tommy, who lived in his stomach and came out through his throat to hold his finger in the mirror when he was alone. After the operation, the punishments intensified and Joseph became less docile. Stephen kept a homemade cat-o'-nine-tails fashioned from leather and rawhide laces. He would chase Joseph to his room and pull up the mattress and the bed spring and reach for him as Joseph cowered on the floor in the corner of the frame nearest the wall, cracking him on the back, the arms, the head. When Joseph was 8 and asked to go to the zoo with his school class, Anna hit him on the head 4 times with a short, heavy hammer used for driving nails through leather. A blow for each word she was about to say. No zoo for you. Joseph ran from room to room, banging his own head against the kitchen table and the walls until he bled, with Anna behind him, chasing him with a broom. Joseph stole a small missal from the school chapel at age 7. A black and gold prayer book he believed had magical powers, that by praying with it he could become smart again after falling behind during his recovery. The teacher noticed it was missing and accused him. That evening, Stephen told Anna to keep the money locked up. We have a thief in the house. For a week each night, the Kallingers made Joseph kneel with bare knees on a strip of coarse sandpaper used for sanding leather and rubber. 1 hour per night. He hid the missal on the top shelf of his closet, undiscovered. He eventually threw it down a sewer on the way to school. At 8, on his birthday, Anna took down from the window the papier-mâché Christmas tree he'd made at school and hung there the day before. On the walk to Mass, she told him she'd burn it if he didn't stop his nonsense. He refused to walk. She called him a truant and a thief, and said she wished she'd never taken him to her house. He said he wished she hadn't either. She told him they'd send him back, and he told her she'd never given him a birthday present. She said every day was his birthday, the room, the clothes, the Plymouth rides to the country, all of it. That afternoon, during the English lesson at St. Boniface, he took the wardrobe key from the corner of the teacher's blotter while she read his composition, went back to the empty classroom during the library period, opened the wardrobe, slashed the pockets of 2 coats, and cut the buttons off 3 others with the penknife he found in a trash can. locked the wardrobe again, replaced the key, and rejoined the line. When Joseph was 11, the Kallingers discovered that rolls of quarters were missing from their bedroom closet. Joseph had been taking them to bribe neighborhood children to go to the movies with him on Saturday afternoons, the only time he was allowed out alone. He hid the leftover coins under a loose brick near a fence across East Sterner Street. Anna whispered something to Stephen, and Stephen grabbed Joseph by both wrists, walked him to the kitchen stove, and held the fingertips of his right hand over the oaken burner and pushed them into the flame. Then his left hand, then his right hand again. Stephen intoned each time, "This will burn the demon thief out of the fingers that steal." Anna watched with admiration while Joseph screamed and thrashed. When Stephen released him, Anna shut off the faucet when Joseph tried to run cold water over his hands. "You must feel the pain with your body and soul," she said. The Kallingers burned his fingertips 6 times in total over the following year. Joseph kept stealing the coins and kept enduring the burns, so great was his loneliness. In the summer of 1944, 8-year-old Joseph climbed down into one of 3 large abandoned oil tanks on a vacant lot 4 blocks from home, a place he called the Holes, where he talked to the spirits he thought lived inside and felt at peace. 3 older boys were already inside. One held a knife against Joseph's throat and told him not to make a sound or he'd be cut. They pulled down his pants and pushed him to the floor, and one of them performed oral sex on him while the others watched. He went back to the store and pulled heels off shoes and filled bushel baskets with heel pads. He'd never had any sex instruction, beyond being told that sex was connected to a demon that Dr. Daly had removed. 10 days after coming home from Downington Camp in the summer of 1949, 12-year-old Joseph took a lip knife from Stephen's workbench and boarded a bus on a Saturday afternoon. 1 mile from the Kallingers' Neshaminy cottage, he saw a boy about his own age walking along a dirt road parallel to the highway. He got off the bus, waited by an old oak tree, stopped the boy with a cheerful hello, and lured him to the creek on the pretense of going fishing. When they reached the water, and the boy asked where the rod and reel were, Joseph moved the knife toward him and told him to drop his pants. The boy dropped his pants. Joseph told him to take off his shorts too. The boy, shivering and too frightened to run, dropped his underpants. Joseph was about to do to him what he believed Dr. Daly had done to him. Then he put the knife back in his pocket and ran into the fields and into the woods, and didn't stop until he collapsed on the front lawn of the Kallingers' cottage a mile away. What if I had killed that kid, he thought. He did nothing to me. I'll never do this again. He walked to the spring house and dropped the lip knife into the well. Joseph stole the knife with the green handle from his father's workbench, and in his bedroom at night, kneeling on his bed, quietly carved a hole in the flowered wallpaper and plaster of his bedroom wall. Stephen discovered it, beat him, and replastered the wall. Joseph recut it. This happened repeatedly. He began collecting photographs of partially naked men and women from pornographic magazines he found in trash cans. In time, he was no longer able to masturbate unless he had first cut a hole in a picture of a woman's breast or stomach. When he stabbed the photograph, he felt potent. One afternoon, while standing at his workbench, Joseph, then 15 years old, said he saw a bright white light, and in the center of it, a large figure. A deep, resonant voice told him, "Joe Kallinger, you are a special person. Your mission is to control the brain through the feet. This is what I, God of the universe, command you to do. You will heal and save mankind." The light and figure disappeared. Joseph immediately began the first of what would become more than 40,000 orthopedic experiments he would perform over the next 21 years, fashioning heel wedges from leather and rubber, tilting the foot inward, developing a theory that the wedges changed the position of the body, which produced chemical changes in the brain, which would lead to the mental and emotional healing God had instructed him to accomplish. Around the same time, a belly laugh began to come out of him without warning, roaring up from deep inside with a will and personality of its own. His head jerked sideways when he laughed. His body twisted and turned with undulating movements. He smeared lipstick on walls and windows. He locked himself in the bathroom for hours and talked to himself. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize his own face. He tried to hold his hand over his mouth, but the laughter continued. One night he discovered that the Kallingers had installed a Yale lock on their bedroom door, one controllable only from inside. They now kept a baseball bat near the door. Anna filed an incorrigibility petition against him in April 1953. It was dismissed. She could point to no instance of violence or wrongdoing. A few days after the conversation about the lock and the baseball bat, Joseph moved into a furnished room 6 blocks from the Kallinger store on 6th and Somerset Streets and continued working for Stephen. The director of the YWCA Christmas production at 2nd and Allegheny asked Stephen to let Joseph try out for Dickens's A Christmas Carol. He got the lead, Scrooge. For the first time in his life, he was let out of the Kallinger store alone at night. He went to rehearsals at the YWCA almost every night. On stage, he played Scrooge, sobbing the tears of the solitary child, and a woman in the front row whispered to her companion, "That kid's good." 3 curtain calls. At breakfast the next morning, Joseph told the Kallingers the director had encouraged him to study acting and become an actor. Stephen banged the table with his coffee spoon. Anna winked at Stephen, then squatted Joseph's wooden box on the floor and told him to act right now, their audience. He stood on the box and began a Hamlet soliloquy. Stephen muttered about peasants and slaves. Anna flicked drops of water at him from her glass. Joseph forgot the next line and froze. "Get off the box," Anna ordered. "With God's help and your parents' help," Stephen said, snapping his fingers, "you will be a shoemaker." The YWCA director came back twice over the next year, asking to include Joseph in the spring productions. She was politely refused each time. At 13, Joseph also met Hilda Bergman at the Howard Movie Theatre on a Saturday afternoon. A thin, flat-chested girl with a gaunt face and dark impressions under her cheekbones, rocking someone else's baby in the dark. Her fragility gave him the courage to say hello. They saw each other for over a year before they had sex, standing in the unlighted walkway of a mill on Lehigh Avenue. They had full intercourse, and Joseph delighted in her tiny breasts. What made him potent was not Hilda, she didn't figure in his fantasies at all, but the images of cutting with a knife that had accumulated since the hernia operation. When he shut them off, his penis stayed limp, so he kept them on. At 16, Joseph dropped out of Northeast High School to work full-time in the Kallinger store and save money to marry Hilda. Without her parents' blessing or the Kallingers, they took a bus to Elkton, Maryland, and were married by a justice of the peace with strangers as witnesses. After the marriage fell apart in the mid-1950s, Joseph married Elizabeth Baumgard. They had 4 children together, and he adopted 3 from his first marriage. He beat them with a homemade cat-o'-nine-tails, burned them with matches and lit cigarettes, put their heads in the toilet, and made them kneel for hours on concrete floors. He ran the shoe repair business while continuing his orthopedic experiments. In 1969, he had his 3 older children, Stephen Jr., Mary Jo, and Joseph Jr., dig a hole 20 feet deep under the floor of a warehouse he'd bought on East Haggart Street. He climbed down alone at night by candlelight. He conducted rituals, and a chant emerged from inside him, words he didn't recognize and couldn't understand, repeating over and over in rising intensity. He realized the words were coming not from the mud walls around him, but from within his own body. He believed the voice was angry at him. On January 22, 1972, Mary Jo and Joseph Jr. ran away from home together. Joseph took a .45 automatic from the store, found them coming out of a movie theater on Kensington Avenue with 3 neighborhood friends, followed them in a taxi, pointed the gun at them through the open taxi door, and brought them home. He sent his wife and the 2 younger boys out for pizza, handcuffed Joseph Jr. to the refrigerator handle, and burned Mary Jo's inner thigh repeatedly with a heated spatula, telling her, "You will never run away from me again." After the 3rd or 4th reheating, he noticed pieces of burnt flesh on the spatula, washed it, and put it in a drawer. He then checked the wound and saw a circle of discolored flesh between 3 and 4 inches in diameter on the inside of her right thigh. He untied her hands and ankles, gave each of them $5 in coins, and went into the store to work on his orthopedic experiments. A week later, on the 30th of January, the children reported him to police. Mary Jo, Joseph Jr., and Michael filed child abuse charges. Joseph was arrested and taken to the Philadelphia detention house. In a psychiatric examination at City Hall, 2 psychiatrists concluded he was suffering from a schizophrenic process, probably of the paranoid type. He was sent to F Block at Holmesburg Prison for 60 days of evaluation. The Holmesburg psychiatrist diagnosed him with an inadequate personality, not psychotic, and declared him competent to stand trial. At sentencing on January 17, 1973, Judge Edward Bradley gave him 4 years of psychiatric probation. He was required to report to the Community Mental Health Center at Episcopal Hospital. After a 5-minute interview, the interviewer told him there was nothing wrong with him. That was the end of treatment. In January 1972, the same week he burned Mary Jo, the god who had appeared to him at 15, appeared again in the store and said one sentence, "Joseph, I control you now." After the orthopedic experiments failed, the orders from God changed. Instead of heal mankind, the command became, "Destroy it, kill every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth." Starting in the winter of 1973, Joseph began taking his 12-year-old son Michael on buses to random suburban towns in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Michael broke into houses while Joseph waited outside. They did this approximately twice a week for months. In June 1974, on a country road in New Jersey, Michael came back from a break-in and told Joseph, "From now on, you'll have to go in with me." Joseph agreed. He then took out a $45,000 life insurance policy on Joey and one of his younger sons. Joey, 13 years old, was murdered in Philadelphia. Joseph reported him as a runaway. The body was found in August 1974 under rubble at a demolition site, but the cause of death could not be determined. The insurance company refused to pay the claim, and Joseph later admitted to drowning him. On July 7, 1974, Joseph and Mike stopped in front of the Mann Recreation Center on 5th Street and Allegheny Avenue. Outside, near the swimming pool, they spotted a short, skinny, dark-skinned boy, about 9 or 10 years old, wearing sneakers and ragged clothes. He was standing alone, flipping a cigarette lighter on and off repeatedly. Mike approached the boy, whose name was Jose Colazzo, and Joseph told Jose they needed help moving boxes of ribbon and would pay him. Jose agreed, saying he had to be home by 9. They walked for less than half an hour to an abandoned rug factory at Hancock and Westmoreland Streets. Inside, it was pitch black. Jose drew back, saying he had to go home. They forced him up the stairs, holding his arms tightly. On a small landing, Joseph cut the cord of an old electric fan with his penknife, while Michael undressed Jose. They bound his hands and ankles with sections of the cord, gagged him with his own sock and black tape, then jammed a hand cutter into his rectum. He struggled and tried to yell, but could not make much sound. Michael then cut off Jose's penis with the hand cutter. Joseph saved the piece of flesh in a plastic bag. They untied Jose, who was likely dead, picked up his clothes, and left. Afterward, Joseph sealed the flesh in plaster of Paris, keeping it as a trophy near his workbench for a week, before storing it under the floor at his Haggard Street house. 2 weeks later, the stench forced him to throw it down a sewer 4 blocks away. This is where things got even more serious, for he was about to start a murder spree that would make him a celebrity. They called him the Butcher of Plainfield and the Plainfield Ghoul, inspiring books and movies like Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 Psycho and the Chainsaw Massacre. But very few people know the actual story of Edward Theodore Gein, the human behind the monster. So this video will be about what happened before the murders, because no one becomes Edward Gein overnight. Edward Theodore was born on August 27, 1906, to Augusta and George Gein, both of German descent, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Eddie was the second of 2 boys born to the couple. The firstborn was Henry, who was 5 years older than Eddie. George worked many jobs, but never made enough money to support the family. He was an orphan born in Coon Valley, Wisconsin, who had little opportunity for education, and he struggled all his life to hold things together. He was a tanner, a carpenter for the railroad, and even got a job at the city power plant, but specialized in drinking until he passed out. He was a chronic alcoholic, weak, passive, and ineffective. In fact, Augusta despised him and saw him as a worthless creature not fit to hold down a job, let alone care for their children. She took it upon herself to not only raise the children according to her beliefs, but also to provide for the family financially. She started a grocery business in La Crosse the year Eddie was born, and it brought in a fair amount of money to support the family in a comfortable fashion. She worked hard and saved money so that the family could move to a more rural area, away from the immorality of the city and the sinners that inhabited it. Eventually, she moved them to a 155-acre farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, isolated from any evil influences that could disrupt her family. The closest neighbors were almost a quarter of a mile away. The farm became the family's permanent residence and remained so for the rest of Ed's life. Plainfield was a small community. At the time of Ed's arrest, more than 4 decades later, its population was less than 700. The people who lived there were warm, friendly, and independent. They preferred the wide open spaces, and everything revolved around hunting and fishing. The talk in the bowling alley where they gathered for coffee was always about the outdoors. When the fish were running or during deer season, they just locked the doors of their businesses and went. Everyone understood. The Geins were part of that community in the way that farm families were, known to their neighbors, present at the edges of town life, recognizable faces in a place where everyone knows everyone by name and address. The farm sat on sandy soil, and Ed recalled that when the family arrived, the neighbors did not share advice on how to work it. They were not real farmers, and it took some adjusting until they became self-sufficient. The Geins kept the farm neat and well-maintained, and never worked on Sundays, orders from God, written in the scripture and recited by Augusta herself. Although Augusta tried diligently to keep her sons away from the outside world, she was not entirely successful because it was necessary for the boys to attend school. Ed attended the local country school, and his performance was pretty average, although he excelled in reading. It was the reading of adventure books and magazines that stimulated Eddie's imagination and allowed him to momentarily escape into his own world. His schoolmates shunned Eddie because he was effeminate and shy, but also kind of odd, having a tendency towards seemingly random laughter, as if at his own private jokes. He had no friends, and when he attempted to make them his mother, scolded him. Although his mother's opposition to making friends saddened Eddie, he saw her as the epitome of goodness and followed her rigid orders the best he could. However, Augusta was rarely pleased with her boys, and she often verbally abused them, believing that they were destined to become failures like their father. During their teens and throughout their early adulthood, the boys remained detached from people outside of their farmstead and had only the company of each other. Augusta was, by all accounts, the dominant force in the household. Hard-working, deeply thrifty, and moralistic to extreme, she handled all family decisions. At times, she managed the farm work herself and even found jobs for George when he failed to find his own. Every day, Augusta read passages from the Bible to her boys, but with a twist. She deliberately sought the verses about death, divine punishment, and about the wages of sin. Ed quoted her saying that every woman except herself were prostitutes and instruments of the devil. She drilled into Ed that sexual experience before marriage was wrong. Her exact words, as Ed later repeated them to a psychiatrist, were, "If a woman is good enough for intercourse, she is good enough for marriage." Ed absorbed all of it. After finishing 8th grade, Ed had to remain at the farmhouse. George Gein died on April 1st, 1940, of heart failure. He was 65 years old. He had been a semi-invalid for some time before the end, drinking less than he had in earlier years. Eddie and Henry both took on odd jobs around town to help cover living expenses in the absence of their father. The brothers were generally considered reliable and honest by the rest of the community. It was babysitting that Eddie really enjoyed because children were easier for him to relate to than his peers. He was in many ways socially and emotionally retarded. This became a regular part of his life. He was a quiet little handyman who ate in his neighbors' homes, helped with their chores, and looked after their children. Locals, especially children, liked him. He worked as a handyman and part-time carpenter around the neighborhood. In 1951, Ed began receiving a farm subsidy from the federal government. He worked at times for the local municipal road crew and for crop threshing crews in the Plainfield area. Ed learned to shoot a rifle at around 8 years old, and he enjoyed hunting squirrels. He tried roller skates once. His brother Henry's pair fell on the floor really hard and never tried again. That was, as he put it at his trial, 50 years later, the end of roller skating for him. He skied for most of his life, practiced archery, watched basketball games and other sports. He played the violin, the accordion, and the mouth organ. He and Henry attended dances together, though as Ed put it, we were too self-conscious to dance. He enjoyed square dancing for a time, and he went to the movies regularly, preferring adventure and Western stories to love stories. He did not have electricity at home and would go to the Hill family house to watch television. If he was there around supper time, Irene would offer him a meal. She remembered him as having a kind of sly grin that bothered her slightly. Otherwise, she said, he was personally clean and always agreeable. Henry worked away from the farm a good deal of the time. On one occasion, he was a foreman for a farmer who employed Jamaican labourers. Ed said of him, he was the only man in the area who could handle those guys. He looked up to his brother Henry and saw him as a hard worker and a man of strong character. Ed thought of himself as someone who tried to be a good neighbour. He felt that people took advantage of him. People would come to visit me, he said in an interview, but I would soon find that they only came to borrow things or to ask for my help. With the exception of a couple of families, he was not invited into other homes, though he noted that the women were kinder in this regard than the menfolks. Henry was worried about Eddie's unhealthy attachment to their mother. On several occasions, Henry openly criticized their mother, something that shocked his brother. Eddie saw his mother as pure goodness and was mortified that his brother did not see her in the same way. It was possibly these incidents that led to the untimely and mysterious death of Henry in 1944. On May 16th, Eddie and Henry were fighting a brush fire that was burning dangerously close to their farm. According to police, the two separated in different directions, attempting to put out the blaze. During their struggle, night quickly approached, and soon Eddie lost sight of Henry. After the blaze was extinguished, Eddie supposedly became worried about his missing brother and contacted the police. The police then organized a search party and were surprised upon reaching the farm to have Eddie lead them directly to the missing Henry, who was lying dead on the ground. The police were concerned about some of the things surrounding Henry's death. For example, Henry was lying on a piece of earth that was untouched by fire, and he had bruises on his head. Although Henry was found under strange circumstances, police were quick to dismiss foul play. No one could believe Shy Eddie was capable of killing anyone, especially his brother. Later, the county coroner would list asphyxiation as the cause of death, and later suspicion has focused on Ed, but no charges were ever filed. The only living person Eddie had left was his mother, and that was the only person he needed. However, he would have his mother all to himself for a very brief period. Augusta suffered a stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Ed devoted himself to her care. She had a second stroke not long after, and died on December 29, 1945, at the age of 67. Ed cried when he talked about her. He told Dr. Schubert, the psychiatrist who assessed him after his arrest 12 years later, that she didn't deserve all the suffering. He believed her second stroke was caused by a neighbor named Smith, whom he held responsible for upsetting her. After his arrest, more than a decade later, he was still saying this with conviction. He described her simply as good in every way. After Augusta's death, Ed stayed on. He boarded up the rooms his mother used, the upstairs, the downstairs parlour, and the living room, and he preserved them as a shrine to her, leaving them untouched for the years to follow. He resided in the lower level of the house, making use of the kitchen area and a small room located just off of the kitchen, which he used as a bedroom. The rest of the house fell into squalor. Ed sold the stock and let the farm go. He said he preferred to let it reseed itself to woodland. He sometimes thought about selling the property to visit relatives around the country or to settle somewhere else. He even made half-hearted attempts, but nothing came of it. Life moved on, but he didn't. He was stuck in the past, doing the same things he did when the family was whole. The babysitting, the odd jobs, the threshing crews, the road work with Boyd Kelly's crew, and the grocery trips to the hills. He couldn't let go. He kept reading. He went to the movies alone, the same Western and adventure movies he always watched. The music stopped after Augusta died, and Eddie slowly died with her, making room for the ghoul of Plainfield to be born. After the death of his mother, Eddie became increasingly lonely. He spent much of his spare time reading pulp magazines and anatomy books. The rooms he inhabited were full of periodicals about Nazis, South Sea headhunters, and shipwrecks. From his readings, Eddie learned about the process of shrinking heads, exhuming corpses from graves, and the anatomy of the human body. He became obsessed with these weird stories, and he would often recount some of them to the children he babysat. Eddie also enjoyed reading the local newspapers. His favorite section was obviously the obituaries. It was from the obituaries that Eddie would learn of the recent deaths of local women. Having never enjoyed the company of the opposite sex, he would quench his lust by visiting graves at night. Although he later swore to police that he never had sexual intercourse with any of the dead women he had exhumed, they smelled too bad, he did take a particular pleasure in peeling their skin from their bodies and wearing it. He was curious to know what it was like to have breasts and a vagina, and he often dreamed of being a woman. He was fascinated with women because of the power and hold they had over men. He acquired quite a collection of body parts, some of which included preserved heads. On one occasion, a young boy that he sometimes looked after visited Eddie's farm. He later said that Eddie had showed him human heads that he kept in his bedroom. Eddie claimed the shriveled heads were from the South Seas, relics from headhunters. When the young boy told people of his experience, his story was quickly dismissed as a figment of the young boy's imagination. Then, somewhat later, the boy was vindicated when two other young men paid a visit to Eddie Gein's farm. They too had seen the preserved heads of women, but thought them to be just strange Halloween costumes. Rumours began to circulate, and soon most of the townspeople were gossiping about the strange objects Eddie supposedly possessed. However, no one took the story seriously until Bernice Worden disappeared years later. In fact, people would often joke with Eddie about having shrunken heads, and Eddie would just smile or make reference to having them in his room. No one thought he was telling the truth, or maybe they just didn't want to believe it was true. On the morning of November 16th, 1957, Ed was up at around 6 a.m. It was raining outside, so he waited for another half an hour before the rain stopped. He had a kerosene stove that needed fuel, and the Worden hardware store had run a sale on permanent antifreeze the week before, and he wanted to buy some more before the sale ended. He stopped at the Standard station on the way in for the kerosene, then pulled up in front of Worden's and parked right out in the open on Main Street. He bought the antifreeze, and on his way back out, he started thinking about a rifle in the store's rack. He considered trading in his Marlin on something that could handle all three calibers: shorts, longs, and long rifle. And the Marlin wouldn't do it, despite what the seller told him. So he went back in to have a look. Nobody was around on deer season. The whole town was out hunting. Around 3 that afternoon, back at the farm, the neighbor Eck stopped by to apologize for shooting a deer on Gein's property. But Ed was in the middle of swapping out the snow tires and was too busy to get into it. A couple of hours later, the hill boy came by because his car wouldn't start, and Ed helped him fix it, and the boy drove him into the village. At the hills, Irene made supper. She was cooking pork chops while Ed sat on the davenport and played a game with one of the younger kids. Then Jim Vroman, Irene's son-in-law, came in from town with news. Something had happened at the Worden store, and the state crime lab was on its way. Boy, someone sure must have been bloodthirsty, Ed said. He thought it might be worth going downtown to see what was going on. Deputy Dan Chase found him in the car a short while later, sitting with the hill boy. Chase walked up and said, "Eddie, I would like to talk to you." And no one saw it coming. It would have been hard to anyway, because he was an oddball to start with, but losing his mother, or what he called my best friend and the love of my life, accelerated his mental decline. He was already fragile, and whatever latent fixation he had when she was alive became active and behavioral. It was a transition into madness through loneliness, grief, and mental illness. Like I said, no one becomes Ed Gein overnight. Gary Leon Ridgway was introduced to this hellhole on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons born to Thomas Newton Ridgway and Mary Rita Steinman. Thomas Newton Ridgway grew up on a farm near Roswell, New Mexico, sent there as a boy after his own parents in Kentucky could not afford to keep him. He served as an aircraft mechanic in the Army Air Corps during World War II, married once before meeting Mary Rita, and fathered a son from that earlier union. He met Mary Rita Steinman at a USO dance sometime around 1946 or 47, and they married shortly after. Their first son, Greg, was born in October 1947. And then Gary came in February 1949. A third boy, Thomas Edward, called Ed or Eddie, was born in 1951. Tom drove long-haul trucks and took construction work in the summers during those early years. The income was irregular enough that the family rarely maintained a separate household, more often renting rooms from other families than keeping their own place. Greg Ridgway, interviewed by defense investigators during Gary's capital proceedings in 2002, recalled that his mother described the early years of the marriage by saying that all she and Tom had was a can of soup to split. The family never went on welfare because Tom believed in earning what he needed and paying back what he owed, but they grew their own food when they could and scavenged spare parts from junkyards. One of the worst sins a Ridgway could commit, Greg said, was to throw something away before it was completely used up. Tom Ridgway was notoriously frugal, and Gary was the same. Both of them hated to waste money. When Gary's own son, Matthew, was old enough, Gary took him along on the same kind of foraging expeditions through junkyards that Tom had modelled, picking through wrecked cars for anything salvageable, turning over seat cushions, running fingers into cracks in the upholstery, looking for dropped coins. Matthew later told investigators that this was a regular outing, Gary working methodically through the rows of wrecked cars with his son beside him, pocketing whatever change had slipped out of other people's pockets. Relatives on both sides of the family described Tom and Gary consistently as penny pinchers. Neither Tom nor Mary Rita drank or smoked. At one point during the Idaho years, Tom and Mary Rita tried running a restaurant and bar, but Tom grew tired of the environment and the attention other men paid his wife, and they closed it. Tom went back to trucking and construction. Dad was always gone, Greg told the investigators. Always trying to do something to make ends meet. While the family lived in Utah and Tom was away on a trucking run, the youngest boy, Eddie, contracted a high fever that left him with some degree of brain damage. He was considered mildly mentally retarded from that point forward, and the family absorbed this without much discussion. By 1959, the family relocated to Bremerton, Washington, where Mary Rita's father, Ed Steinman, owned a hardware store. They lived above the store for approximately a year. Gary was in the 3rd grade at the time. He remembered his grandfather as strict, someone who let no one interfere with the store's operation and who, in Gary's perception, favored Greg over him. His grandmother, Clara, he recalled warmly. She cooked, kept a cake ready when the family came by, and operated quietly within the constraints her husband set. Tom commuted by ferry each day to Seattle during the Bremerton period, working first for Grey Line tour buses and then for Greyhound. In 1960, the family moved again to Seattle, where Tom eventually took a position driving buses for the regional transit agency, Metro. Mary Rita took a job at the J.C. Penney store in Renton in the men's clothing department. She stayed 30 years and retired as one of the store's most recognized employees. A local newspaper ran a feature story on her retirement. The family bought their first house around 1960, a small rambler with a large lot just east of the airport. Tom and Mary Rita lived there until they died. All three Ridgway sons spent their teenage years there. Mary Rita ran the household with clear expectations. She kept the boys in the Catholic faith, despite Tom's inability to convert, because his prior marriage barred him from the church. Greg recalled that she kept them attending until around 1965, when her own father died and she finally stopped pressing. She was one of the first working mothers in her immediate community, and Greg described her to the investigators as a strong woman who knew her own mind. She made her sons responsible for their conduct. One expression of hers stayed with Greg across decades: "Don't ever date anybody you wouldn't want to marry." Gary struggled in school from the beginning. He was dyslexic, reversed letters, and could not read the way other children read. His teachers assessed him as slow. Family discussions about placing him in a special education class took place around the 4th grade, though he could not say precisely when he was held back a grade, only that it happened. He was placed in a remedial reading class. Getting through school seemed an endless process to him. He attended Tyee High School and graduated in June 1969 at the age of 20, 2 full years older than most of his classmates, with an IQ recorded in the low 80s. He had not given much thought to what he was going to do in life. Greg went on to the University of Washington, studied physics, and spent his career as a computer software engineer. Greg told the investigators that the family never talked much about Gary and Eddie's learning difficulties. He received praise for academic success, while the subject of his brother's struggles went largely unaddressed. Gary's own account was that Greg was the favored son, and that he and Ed were measured against Greg and found lacking. Greg disputed this, maintaining their parents treated all 3 boys equally. Gary also contended with asthma and chronic allergies from childhood. His eyes swelled and watered regularly. Defense team notes record that his eyelids were often droopy and puffy, and that other children frequently assumed he was crying. The allergies continued into adult life. At Kenworth, co-workers sometimes noticed his reddened, watering eyes and took the condition for emotional distress, adding to his reputation among them as an odd figure, the man who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. He explained the allergies more than once to people who did not ask. He was also a bedwetter into junior high school, which his mother eventually addressed by having him help strip his bed and then sitting him in a tub of cold water while she washed him. Rule notes that she scrubbed him aggressively during these episodes, and that being touched there made him aware that it felt good, though the subject of sex was never discussed in the Ridgway household. He told the investigators he remembered those incidents clearly. He recalled persistent difficulty orienting himself when he wandered from home as a young boy, particularly during the Utah years. He could not find his way back. In Pocatello, Idaho, a boy named Dennis waited for Gary in an alley after school and beat him up regularly. Tom Ridgway's response was a warning: come home beaten up one more time and he would beat Gary himself. He then showed Gary how to put his hands up, how to jab and punch. Gary got Dennis on the ground eventually and held his arms, and could see his father watching from a block away, smiling. Both boys were crying. Around the same period, Gary failed a grade and threw rocks through the school windows in response, breaking several. He also set fires in garages and dry fields near wherever the family lived, and told investigators he was drawn to fire without being able to explain why. He carried a knife with him from around the 6th grade. It was black with 4 folding blades, and he liked the feel of it in his pocket. At 16, Gary lured a 6-year-old boy into woodland near his school and stabbed him once through the ribs, into his liver. The boy survived and did not identify his attacker. Gary ran home and hid in the basement. He told investigators he had not planned it and that he was more afraid the boy would live and identify him than he was worried about whether the boy would die. Gary liked shop class and described doing well there. He liked sports too, but he was being placed with older, more advanced students because of his age, not his skill level. And he quit. He worked instead. In junior high, Gary was quiet. He did not feel he could keep up with other kids and said little. By high school, his ease around people improved, particularly with girls. He was a loner outside of school, he said, and had no close friends. Greg noted that Gary was considerably more successful in conversation with women than Greg himself had been at the same age. Gary met Claudia Barrows during his sophomore year. Both worked at a supermarket in Burien, west of the airport, and her father was a career military man. They went to movies at military base theaters, sometimes parked in his car, and dated through the rest of high school and into 1969. Mary Rita tried to discourage the match before they married. When Gary asked her why, she said she thought Claudia might be a little wild. In June 1969, Gary began working at Kenworth Truck Company and enlisted in the Navy, a 2-year enlistment with a 4-year Naval Reserve commitment, which he reasoned was better than being drafted into the Army. Because Greg and Eddie were both about to ship overseas, Greg to Korea with the Army and Eddie to Vietnam, the Navy released Gary early from boot camp so he could see his brothers before they left. During that 10-day leave, Gary spent most of his time with Claudia. He told the investigators she was the first love he ever had, that he loved her from 1965 to 1971. Gary served as a deckhand aboard the USS Vancouver, a ship that transported and landed Marines by landing craft and helicopter, based largely at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Crew members worked 8-hour shifts and were released for shore liberty in the evenings. Most of those evenings ended in the bars near the base. Gary drank. Alcohol was cheap, he said. He tried marijuana once and found it did nothing for him. He formed relationships with Filipina prostitutes in the bars, whom he later said always treated him well and was treated twice for gonorrhea during his service. The ship made one trip to Vietnam, approximately a week before Gary received an honorable discharge after 23 months and 28 days. Gary and Claudia Barrows married during a leave in a military ceremony at Fort Lawton in Seattle in August 1970, performed by a military chaplain over her parents' objections. They found a small apartment near the base in San Diego, and Gary came home most nights. He told investigators he liked married life, the company, the stability, someone his age to talk to, and regular sex. He returned to sea repeatedly, and each homecoming brought changes. Writing was difficult for him, and his letters to Claudia during deployments were not particularly tactful. Both of them were unfaithful. She was bored and lonely in San Diego, and began to date. He did not consider his contact with prostitutes as infidelity. When he returned and she told him she saw other men while he was away, he branded her a whore in conversations for years afterward. She told him the marriage was not working and left for the airport. He told investigators that panic set in and that he considered calling the airline with a bomb threat to stop the plane. He did not. The divorce was finalized in 1972. Back in Seattle, Gary moved into the family house and began cruising the Renton Loop, a circuit past the high school and movie theaters where young people drove with windows down on weekend nights. He met Marcia Lorene Brown there, short and very heavy, not the slim blonde he later described to others. She did not date much in high school because the boys all wanted cheerleader types. When they married in December 1973, Mary Rader would not permit a separate household. They moved into the family home, where Mary Rader controlled Gary's paycheck and made decisions on Marcia's behalf as well, including whether she could get her ears pierced. The couple then decided to move out because Marcia and Mary Rader did not get along at all. During the marriage, they lived in several residences in Renton, Federal Way, and West Seattle. At some point, they moved to a small house in Maple Valley Heights. The house sat in an isolated spot at the end of a road, with high-voltage power lines running directly over the backyard, close enough that they hummed audibly on still days. The lines made many people veer away from the property. The television news around that time carried warnings from scientists that living near power lines could cause cancer. The location suited Gary well enough. They socialized with another couple on weekends, potluck dinners, and cheap wine. And all four attended a new Southern Baptist congregation whose minister held services at a compound in Maple Valley called the Aqua Barn, which operated a swimming pool and a stable that rented horses. The pastor preached that wives and daughters who did not obey their husbands would be barred from heaven, that women could not wear red or cut their hair or hold positions of authority in the congregation. Gary followed these directives entirely and stood to read scripture aloud on Sundays. He was skinny in an oversized suit, hair combed down over his forehead, entirely serious. When the pastor criticized the other couple for insufficient attendance and they left the church, Gary stayed. His son, Matthew, was born on September 5, 1975. According to the prosecutor's summary of evidence, Marcia later reported to investigators that Gary enjoyed sex outdoors and was interested in bondage. She said he was often gone in the evenings for long periods, sometimes returning dirty or wet, with no explanation. During the latter years of the marriage, he began coming home later and later without logical explanation. When they walked in the woods together, he liked to hide from her and then creep up behind her to frighten her. He liked to practice walking noiselessly. On at least one occasion, which Gary later acknowledged, he choked her using a police-type hold, his forearm and upper arm around her neck. Their relationship deteriorated. Marcia underwent gastric bypass surgery in the late 1970s, and the weight came off rapidly. She began going out to the Eagles Lodge, staying until closing, telling Gary she spent those nights at a friend's house. He called the friend's house and was told she was not there. They separated in July 1980, and the divorce became final on May 27, 1981. She took primary custody of Matthew. Gary had the boy on alternate weekends. That November, he purchased a house at 2185 932nd Place South, a few blocks from Pacific Highway South. After the divorce, Gary joined Parents Without Partners, a social organization for single parents, and attended meetings regularly. From roughly 1981 to 1985, he maintained a relationship with another member of the group, a woman named Roxanne Theno. He also became engaged to another woman from the group, with a wedding planned for June 1984. She broke it off after meeting someone else. He still worked at Kenworth, punctual attendance, 30 years without being fired, something he told investigators he was proud of. But his conduct at the plant drew notice. In the employee break room, some co-workers found him unusually religious, reading aloud from the Bible, which he sometimes left open on his workstation. He went through phases where he preached about loose women, until spittle flew from his mouth, then cycled without apparent transition into making obscene sexual remarks in the cafeteria. There was also a habit of approaching women from behind and touching them without invitation. One co-worker told investigators he came up behind her and began massaging her shoulders shortly after she started working there, and she made a point not to be alone with him after that. A formal reprimand for sexual harassment followed at some point during this period. Gary asked a co-worker he trusted whether she could believe it. He also submitted suggestions to the plant's safety program in his role as safety monitor, and co-workers responded by mailing him a roll of toilet paper and naming him Safety Man of the Year as a joke. Gary told investigators he learned to take it. At lunch, he sat in the same spot every day in the Kenworth lunchroom, drank tea, and ate a packed lunch. His nicknames at the plant included Wrong Way Ridgway, earned after he painted a design on a truck backward, costing the company $14,000 to fix. He hated the nickname but could not show it, he said, because he feared being fired. There were additional episodes of confusion at the plant during this period, a 3-day stretch in which he added wrong chemicals to the paint, and occasions when he painted the wrong truck entirely. The bosses always let him do it over. A former manager described him to a newspaper as a steady Eddie, a very normal employee, very trouble-free, and said that nothing in Gary's behavior would have suggested what investigators now believed him to be. In February 1985, Gary attended a Parents Without Partners gathering at the White Shutters Inn on Pacific Highway South. A woman named Judith Lynch, nearly 5 years his senior, was there with a friend. She tried at first to ignore him, thinking he was too young, but he was polite and attentive, and they danced and talked. Judith's father was killed in Korea when she was 6. She suffered from epilepsy until her mid-20s, which kept her from driving until her 30s, and driving still made her anxious. She was previously married for 18 years and had 2 adult daughters. Gary courted her over the following weeks, meeting at a McDonald's between their shifts. He was on swing at Kenworth. She taught childcare skills at a local high school. He bought her dinner and came back each week. She told investigators he was always nice and comfortable, that she felt happy and trusting with him. He was welcoming to her daughters and made no objection when one of them moved in with her young family for a time. Gary and Judith married in 1988. They rarely went out. They camped, raised dogs, and kept their yard and houseplants. Gary stopped by his parents' house after every shift. After Tom Ridgway died, he kept stopping, checking on Mary Rita daily. Judith managed their finances, paid the bills, and gave Gary spending money for his workdays. She rarely gave him more than he needed for breakfast, lunch, and gas. They moved several times and bought a better house each time, staying always in South King County, Des Moines from 1989 to 1997, then Auburn. By 2001, they lived on South 348th Street on the West Hill of Auburn, in a house nicer than anything the family owned before. Judith decorated it as she wanted. Dolls, artificial flowers, crocheted Afghans, frilly lace on the chair arms, Christmas stockings with their names embroidered on them hung above the fireplace. They kept a motor home, a newer pickup, and a sedan. Away from work, Gary was a familiar presence in his neighborhood. He kept his lawn in top shape and worked in the garden alongside whoever he was living with at the time. Neighbors described him to investigators and reporters as someone who was always pleasant in over-the-fence conversation, with gardening, swap meets, and garage sales as his main topics. He was quiet to the point of near invisibility in his daily domestic routine, mowing, washing his truck, painting his fence, but always willing to talk if someone came out. Mark Prothero, his defense attorney, who met Gary for the first time shortly after his arrest, described his first impression in his book, Defending Gary. Gary's physical appearance was not what he expected. He was too ordinary, too small, too calm, too polite. He lived beside neighbors for years who barely knew his voice. Mary Rita Ridgway died of colon cancer in the summer of 2001. Gary and his brothers spent the months before her death organizing her financial affairs, and Gary stopped by after work every day until she died. She worried, he told investigators, that the brothers would drift apart after she was gone, and wanted everything taken care of and the family kept together. And maybe it was for the best, because some months later, on November 30th, 2001, Gary's secret life was finally revealed to the public as he was leaving the Kenworth truck factory, where he worked in Renton, Washington. This was the so-called human side of Wrong Way Ridgway, one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. The way Dennis Rader remembered it a few hours into his grilling by police, there had always been raiders in this section of the country. There probably always will be, he said. His ancestors came over from Bavaria back in the 1800s. Rader's kinfolk were good, solid people, working hard, farming the rich soil, trying to follow God's word as best they could. The family's name derived from the German noun Rad, which means wheel. The earliest raiders, it seems, were employed as wheelwrights. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, on March 9, 1945, the oldest of 4 sons. He was also described as being born just outside the tiny town of Columbus, Kansas. Dennis was the first of the 4 sons of William, a former U.S. Marine, and Dorothea Rader. He was baptized at the Zion Lutheran Church in Pittsburgh, where his parents were members. Dorothea May Rader was a bookkeeper, and William Elvin Rader, a former United States Marine and Kansas Gas Service worker. His first 4 or 5 years were spent living on the wheat, dairy and cattle farm owned by his paternal grandparents, who also happened to be cousins, allegedly. Space was tight, as the entire brood lived under the same roof. Both parents worked very long hours and paid little attention to their children at home, and in later years Dennis said he felt neglected. His father was described as strict and God-fearing, but not abusive. He served as a Marine, and after his honorable discharge he landed a job at the Kansas Gas and Electric Power Plant, located about 10 minutes from the family's house. William worked long hours, sometimes pulling double shifts or working part-time at the graveyard. He also did maintenance around the plant and perpetually monitored the myriad gauges that sprouted out of the walls and pipes. Rader looked up to his old man. His mother, Dorothea, had a certain movie star quality about her. When she got dressed up, which she always seemed to for her job as a bookkeeper at Leaker's Family Foods, the neighborhood kids thought she bore an uncanny resemblance to Natalie Wood. To catch a glimpse of her sitting at her desk in the middle of the grocery, elevated up on a little platform above the floor, made them feel as though they'd suddenly been plunked down in the middle of a Hollywood movie set. The elder Raiders took their 4 boys to church and scout meetings, encouraging them to explore the great outdoors. They tried to do right by Dennis, Paul, Bill, and Jeff, although Jeff, as he admitted later, was a hellraiser. All 4 Raider brothers became Boy Scouts. They all liked to go for hikes and loved to hunt and fish. There are no recorded incidents regarding abuse in their family. Some neighbors even said they were a model family, always helpful, and the boys were raised properly. Rader often spent his summers at the family farm of his cousin, Larry Sutherland, in Columbus, Kansas. Sutherland's father became the first true figure of authority in Rader's life. He worked as the town's sheriff, and Rader recalled that he carried himself with the confident swagger of Clint Eastwood in his spaghetti western days. He also looked up to his cousin Larry, who was 5 years his senior, as the older brother he never had. Larry was a bright kid, and the two of them would often build model airplanes together and fantasize about one day becoming pilots. Rader claimed to have heard his parents speak about an incident that occurred one sweltering summer afternoon on Sutherland Farm in hushed tones. Larry was allegedly swimming with another friend in a pond on the family property. At some point during that afternoon, Larry Sutherland disappeared beneath the water and never returned to the surface. Rader was 13 at the time. The boy's body was allegedly later found floating just below the surface of the water. For the rest of his days, whenever Rader revisited the pages of his journal, he always stumbled back to that memory. How, he wondered, could someone be so nonchalant about the death of another human being? In his later interviews with the police, trying to find the roots of his actions, this is what he always went back to: the fact that he never had any feelings about that incident. Despite the fact that it was his own cousin, the boy who he looked up to and built model airplanes with, it puzzled him. The Rader family moved from the parental grandparents' home in a 3-bedroom house in the 4300 block of North Seneca Street. Despite being located on the northwestern edge of town, the neighborhood had a fairly rural feel to it. Rader hung out with a close-knit group of nearly a dozen kids. When school let out, they could often be found walking home together and exploring the sandy banks of the Little Arkansas River, which snaked its way through town. Rader's family bought their first TV set in 1955, when Rader was around 10 years old. The Rader boys loved watching the Mickey Mouse Club. Growing up in Wichita, Rader had an interest in novels, comic books, fishing, and Cub Scouting. By the time 3rd grade rolled around, no one was surprised when he was picked to play Joseph for the Riverview Grade School's Christmas play. School was boring, he wrote, probably because it took him away from his fantasies. Although he possessed a vivid imagination, he never quite figured out how to put it to use in school. He did fairly well in mathematics, but no matter how hard he tried, he could never get his mind around his English classes. Rader did the minimum amount of work necessary for him to slide through school. He'd often sit there in class, half asleep, allowing himself to be pulled away to all those places he fantasized about. No one really paid attention to him back there. And he got the biggest kick out of watching how his teachers would come unglued when one of his fellow students slipped up and got caught nodding off in class. He loved how it would cause the teachers to smash their rulers down on the offending student's desk. Despite telling himself that he was bored out of his wits, Rader wrote that he always plastered a perpetually attentive, serious look on his face, as if he were following every word the teacher uttered. He wrote that one of his favorite pastimes was to stick the tip of his pencil through the middle of a ruler and spin it around like a propeller. Something about the spinning motion lulled and calmed him. The young Dennis Rader fit in well with the simple, don't-rock-the-boat sensibility so prevalent in Kansas's largest city in the 1950s. By the time he was 9 years old, his friends said he wasn't much of anything other than a quiet kid who seemed to have a knack for never standing out. His personality was so predictably even-keeled that many of his classmates at Wichita Heights High School wrote him off as hopelessly boring. He was one of that rare breed of youth who often caused the parents of other kids in his neighborhood to exclaim, "Why can't you be like Dennis Rader?" In junior high, he developed an obsessive and violent crush on America's newest teen sweetheart, Annette Funicello. He longed to drive out to California, kidnap her, and tie her up in ropes, he said. Not at all weird for a predictably even-keeled kid. From a young age, Rader harbored sadistic sexual fantasies centered on controlling, trapping, and torturing helpless women. As a child and teenager, he began acting out these fetishes privately. He engaged in voyeurism by spying on female neighbors, and he would frequently cross-dress using women's clothing and underwear that he stole. He combined these elements with autoerotic asphyxiation, using ropes and bindings on himself to simulate being trapped. But this was a private occurrence, and nobody knew until he mentioned it years later in police interviews. In 8th grade, his father gave him a bit of advice about how to handle those clowns who seemed hell-bent on picking a fight. William showed his son how to punch and where to aim his blows. It wasn't long after that the class bully set his sights on him. Rader matched the kid blow for blow, and nobody else ever picked on Rader again. One night, when everyone was lined up in front of the cafeteria for lunch, the school's biggest jock butted in front of Rader and his buddies. Rader tapped the guy on the shoulder and informed him that he didn't like the jock's cutting in front of him. Rader didn't have a mean look and never raised his voice, but the interloper apologized and walked to the back of the line. Rader would also do the same thing to anyone who bothered his youngest brother, Paulie. He couldn't stomach the thought of other kids harassing Paulie because of his size. He would stare unblinkingly into a foe's eyes and say, "I don't appreciate you teasing Paulie. You need to stop now, or I'm going to have to do something about it." Rader also loved being scared. On Friday nights, he and his buddies would see who could stand being scared the most by horror movies and shows like The Host and Rodney. Originally titled Nightmare, The Host and Rodney was a pioneering, late-night local horror host television program broadcast out of Wichita, Kansas. The show revolved around the comedic and creepy interactions between its two titular characters during commercial breaks of classic monster movies, played by Wichita television legend Tom Leahy Jr., who also wrote the scripts, built the sets, and did his own makeup. The Host was a pompous, grandiloquent, and delightfully sinister intellectual. The host's monster-like assistant, Rodney, played by Lee Parsons, was simple, childlike, and communicated largely through guttural noises, yet he frequently managed to outsmart or rebel against the host's arrogant plans. First hitting the airwaves on KAKE-TV on January 31st, 1958, it is remembered as one of the very first homegrown horror host shows in the United States. Like most kids in the region at that time, Dennis was glued to the television for it. However, rather than a fun, shared social experience with friends, Rader's fascination with the show was deeply solitary and dark. Rader later admitted in interviews and confessions that he was obsessed with the horror movies and local host segments. Instead of being normally scared, the macabre imagery, elements of entrapment in classic horror films, and the dark themes deeply fed into the violent, sadomasochistic fantasies he was already developing as a young teenager. That childhood viewing routine sparked a lifelong twisted fixation on KAK-TV. Decades later, when he began his murder spree as BTK, KAK-TV became his preferred media outlet. He targeted the station specifically, sending them multiple taunting letters, poems, and clues to mock the police and demand national attention. In horror films, the monster or the villain is often defined by a mask or a physical transformation. For Rader, wearing a mask wasn't just a practical way to hide his face from victims, it was actually a psychological trigger. Tom Leahy put on makeup to become the host, and Rader put on his female masks, leather masks, or Xeroxed faces of his victims to become BTK. The mask allowed him to step out of his boring, inadequate reality as Dennis Rader and step into the omnipotent, terrifying character he created in his mind. While studying at Wichita Heights High School, Rader spent most of his out-of-school time working as a bag boy and shelf stocker for a local grocery store to earn money for a motor vehicle. He put in long hours at Leaker's Family Foods, trying to save up enough money for a car. Working was hardly a sacrifice, as deep down he never felt particularly comfortable hanging out with the other kids. He only did that to blend in and not be the loner weirdo. It didn't work every time, though. Dennis once played Linus Van Pelt, the character famous for carrying a security blanket in a production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. Not a good resume for a tough guy wannabe, and he got mocked several times by his friends about it. One night he missed a turn in the road while driving his parents' 58th Plymouth station wagon, careening over a dirt embankment and plunging into a shallow ditch. Rader was hysterical and wailing about the wreck, failing to mention anything about his injured friend. Another red flag added to his insensibility collection. He also had a hobby of making a fake train whistle sound when they were on the tracks. That was enough to make the hair on the back of everyone's neck stand straight up. He'd roar with laughter over the panic he glimpsed on the faces of his pals. He was weird like that, but his friends accepted him anyway. Everyone had a thing, and this was his. Sometimes at night, Rader and a buddy would drive out to the city dump and blast rats with their .22s. They'd sit there in the darkness, waiting for the city's vermin to delude themselves that all was safe. Rader was good at the waiting part. He could sit for a long time doing nothing, just stalking in the dark, waiting for a damn rat to poke its head out of the hole. They spent hours in the car talking about what they are going to do in life. He told his buddies he wanted to be a rocket scientist when he got older, and one of his friends said that by the time high school was finishing up, Dennis was contemplating becoming a game warden. Rader was active in Boy Scouts. He liked the structure of the organization and the order and predictability it provided. Scouting allowed him to put his fascination with string and bindings to use, especially when it came to learning how to tie knots. His favorite was the clove hitch alongside the square knot and the bowline. The clove hitch eventually became his strangler knot, while he used different knots in subsequent crimes, such as a standard granny knot. The clove hitch was a distinct part of his early methodology. He was always prepared, meticulously planning in advance for every event, every trip, and every aspect of his life. One summer, Rader traveled to New Mexico's Philmont Scout Ranch and went on a 50-mile hiking expedition. He insisted on bringing a pack filled with nearly 70 pounds of gear, far above the 45-pound requirement. This directly translated into what he called his hit kits later in life. When he committed his murders, he carried briefcase-sized kits, meticulously packed with multiple types of ropes, bonds, masks, and weapons. After graduating in 1963, Rader attended Kansas Wesleyan University in Salina. He received only mediocre grades and dropped out after 1 year. Because his parents could afford only a portion of the tuition, Rader was constantly strapped for cash. He would drive 90 miles back to Wichita in order to work his old job at Leaker's, always earning just enough to barely get him through. Before long, he began sneaking around at night and jimmying open soda machines and stealing the pop bottles to collect the deposit money. His stint at Kansas Wesleyan did help him acquire how to be an extrovert. He joined a fraternity and quickly became a regular fixture at the beer parties around campus. For the first time in his life, he began consciously constructing a cover for himself that was far different than the one he'd assumed back in his hometown. He transformed himself into something of a third-rate Midwestern bon vivant. He summoned enough nerve to ask out a few of the Wesleyan co-eds. This third-rate Midwestern bon vivant persona became the foundation for the double life he would lead for the next 3 decades. It allowed him to successfully blend into his community as a husband, father, Cub Scout leader, and church council president, completely concealing the violent fantasies and meticulous planning occurring just beneath the surface. Rader joined the United States Air Force on August 17, 1966. He completed basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. In October, he was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, where he attended technical school, specializing in radio communications. After technical school, he worked as an antenna installer and maintenance specialist. He was stationed at Brookley Air Force Base in Mobile, Alabama, followed by assignments in Turkey, Greece, and South Korea. Rader was then transferred to Japan in January 1968, where he spent 6 months stationed at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, followed by 25 months stationed at Tachikawa Airfield in Tokyo. He earned a medal for good conduct and a ribbon for marksmanship. He also earned a National Defense Service Medal because his service coincided with the military being under a state of emergency due to the Vietnam War. Rader received an honorable discharge on August 12, 1970, at the rank of Staff Sergeant, and he subsequently served in the Air Force Reserve Command until June 20, 1972. Shortly after Rader returned to Wichita, following his 4-year hitch in the Air Force, his mother said, "You need to come to church with me. I met a nice girl there who I think you'd like." Her name was Paula Dietz, and she'd graduated from Wichita Heights High School in 1966. The two began dating, and on May 22, 1971, Rader married Paula Dietz in a ceremony held at Christ Lutheran Church. His bride was working as a secretary at the VA hospital. For the ceremony, 2 of his 3 younger brothers stood up with him. He appeared to adore Paula. People noticed that his voice and posture grew softer every time he spoke of her. A year after his discharge, Rader purchased a home in Park City, Kansas, a suburb of Wichita. The family's Park City residence was a 900-square-foot ranch-style home, and they moved in May 1977. Prior to that, they lived in apartments in Wichita. Rader initially worked in the meat department of an IGA supermarket, where his mother was employed as a bookkeeper. From mid-1972 to mid-1973, he worked as an assembler for Coleman, where 2 of his victims, Julie Otero and Catherine Bright, also worked. Julie Otero was a worker on an assembly line at the Coleman Company from the middle of December 1973 until January 3, 1974. Catherine Bright worked as a metal brazier until March 11, 1974, and as an assembler after that. By the summer of 1973, he was working on the assembly line at the Cessna Aircraft Company. But in November 1973, he learned that he and about 500 other workers had been sacked from Cessna due to the oil crisis. In 1973, Rader earned an associate degree in electronics engineering from Butler County Community College in El Dorado, Kansas. This specific degree is what gave him the technical credentials to get hired by ADT Security Services in 1974. Rader's most significant employment was as an alarm technician and installation supervisor for ADT Security Services. He used the technical skills he acquired in the Air Force to install residential and commercial security systems. This job gave him direct access to people's homes, lay out blueprints, and personal information, allowing him to easily scout potential victims without drawing suspicion. His co-workers noted he was incredibly meticulous, earning the nickname Blue Bookman for his rigid adherence to company policy manuals. Business was good because a wave of terror swept through the Wichita area at that time. People were terrified, and local homeowners rushed to buy home security systems to protect themselves from the notorious BTK killer. Because Rader worked for ADT Security Services during this exact window, from 1974 to 1988, he was literally the man sent to install those alarms. He walked into the homes of frightened citizens, looked at their floor plans, installed the wiring, and explained how the security systems worked. He got to listen to his customers talk about how terrified they were of BTK, completely unaware that the killer was standing right in their living room. He then attended Wichita State University and graduated in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science degree, majoring in Administration of Justice. William Rader, who worked for 37 years for the local utility Kansas Gas and Electric, retired in August 1985. Dorothea Rader worked for 26 years as a bookkeeper at Leaker's Family Foods Grocery and retired in January 1986. She was a gentle person, appreciated by her neighbors and others who knew her. After leaving ADT, Rader worked briefly for the U.S. Census Bureau. As a census taker, his job required him to visit various residences to collect information, which once again afforded him a legitimate excuse to knock on doors, interact with the public, and observe the interiors and surroundings of local homes. In 1991, Dennis Rader took a job as a compliance supervisor and code enforcement officer for the Wichita suburb of Park City. Because his duties included animal control, locals frequently referred to him as the town's dog catcher. He held this position for over a decade, right up until his arrest in February 2005. In his role as a compliance officer, Rader gained a reputation among Park City residents as a petty tyrant and an extreme stickler for the rules. He was notorious for measuring the exact height of people's lawns with a tape measure to issue citations and aggressively pursuing minor neighborhood infractions. The position essentially gave him legal authority to control, monitor, and dominate his neighbors, feeding the same psychological need for omnipotence that drove his crimes. Neighbors reported that he was unnecessarily harsh and took a visible, disturbing pleasure in capturing and euthanizing local pets. In one instance, he infamously euthanized a neighbor's dog simply because it had wandered onto his own property. Dennis Rader and his wife Paula had 2 children, a son, Brian, born in 1975, and a daughter, Kerry, born in 1978. Both grew up completely unaware of their father's secret life, experiencing him as a normal, involved, though sometimes rigidly strict dad. When Rader was arrested in February 2005, their lives were completely shattered. The police actually used DNA from Kerry's medical records at Kansas State University to definitively link Rader to the BTK murders. Kerry has been the most public about her experience, becoming a well-known author and activist for crime victims. She spoke extensively about the psychological toll of the revelation, describing a decade of rotting inside with severe anxiety, depression, and PTSD after realizing her childhood memories were used as a cover for a monster. Kerry was recruited by law enforcement to visit her father at the El Dorado Correctional Facility, to interview him regarding unsolved cold cases and missing persons in the Midwest, attempting to use their relationship to get him to confess to other crimes. Unlike his sister, Brian has chosen to remain strictly out of the public eye and rarely spoke to the media. At the time of his father's arrest, Brian was serving in the U.S. Navy as a crew member on a submarine, which really destabilized his life when the news broke. According to his family, he quietly focused on building a private life, dealing with the immense trauma away from the spotlight. Kerry occasionally mentioned him respectfully in interviews, saying that he is doing well, but understandably values his privacy. Dennis Rader's wife, Paula Dietz, was completely unaware of his secret identity for nearly 34 years. She knew him as a dedicated family man, a church council president, and an involved father to their 2 children. Paula did not stand by him. In June 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to the 10 murders, and by July 2005, a judge granted Paula an immediate emergency divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. Rader did not contest it. After the divorce, Paula immediately moved out of Kansas to escape the intense media scrutiny. She chose to completely retreat from the public eye to heal and process the trauma privately. Dennis Rader was a deeply involved member of the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. He maintained a 30-year affiliation with the congregation and held multiple prominent leadership roles, most notably serving as the president of the church council at the time of his arrest in February 2005. Rader climbed the ranks of the church hierarchy to become the congregation's council president. In this administrative role, he was responsible for leading council meetings, managing church business, coordinating with the pastor, and helping oversee the day-to-day operations and governance of the church. Beyond his administrative title, Rader was highly visible to ordinary churchgoers. He regularly volunteered as an usher, welcoming people to services, passing out bulletins, and collecting the weekly offering plates. He also looked after church property, assisted with cleanups, and prepared the facilities for events. Rader used his respected standing in the church as the ultimate shield for his mask of sanity, believing no one would ever suspect a devout, soft-spoken church president of being a serial killer. However, his church role directly led to his capture. In January 2005, Rader sent a package to the police containing a letter asking a direct question: could he communicate via a floppy disk without it being traced back to a specific computer? He specifically directed this inquiry to the lead investigator of the BTK task force, Wichita Police Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, with whom he mistakenly believed he shared a special rapport. Landwehr naturally lied to him. The police placed a deceptive classified ad in the Wichita Eagle newspaper that read, "Rex, it will be okay," reassuring Rader that a floppy disk was an untraceable, secure way to communicate. Believing the police's lie, Rader prepared a text file on a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to mail to a local television station. However, to physically create and print documents, he utilized the resources at his church, Christ Lutheran Church. In January, Rader approached his pastor, Michael Clark, with the floppy disk. He told the pastor that he had the agenda for an upcoming church council meeting saved on the disk and needed to run off some physical copies on the church's printer. Pastor Clark, thinking it was just a routine administrative request from his trusted church council president, obliged and let Rader use the computer to print his materials. What Rader didn't realize was that when he used the church computer, the Microsoft Word software automatically embedded hidden metadata onto the disk, but it was easily recovered using the forensic software Encase. When he later mailed that same disk to KSAS-TV, the local Fox affiliate, forensic investigators easily extracted the deleted metadata. The hidden data contained 2 crucial pieces of information. The file had last been modified at Christ Lutheran Church, and the user who made the last edit was named Dennis. From that point, it took investigators only 9 days to look up the church, see that the council president was a man named Dennis Rader, quietly acquire a matching DNA sample, and arrest him. When Rader was interrogated and realized how he had been caught, he was genuinely shocked and asked Landwehr, "I need to ask you, Ken, how come you lied to me?" Landwehr coolly responded, "Because I was trying to catch you." Jean Granelles met Bernard Rifkin in the 1950s. While most of her childhood friends had settled for a conventional life of domesticity, she pursued a college education. After meeting her husband, Ben, she accompanied him to Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College, which is now called Oklahoma State University. Jean took graduate courses in education and eventually taught an art class there, while Ben received a degree in architectural engineering. Both of them were native New Yorkers, which is where they settled after completing their studies in the early 50s. They leased an apartment in the Bronx and planned to start a family, but due to medical reasons, Jean could not hold a pregnancy all the way. So, in late 1958, when Jean was 36 and Ben was 40, they were approved for an adoption by the Louise Wise Services in Manhattan, an agency that specialized in placing Jewish children with Jewish families. And although Jean was not Jewish by birth, she converted to Judaism after marrying Ben. Before long, they were presented with a baby boy who weighed 8 pounds, 6 ounces when he was born 3 weeks earlier, on January 20th, 1959. His biological mother was a 20-year-old student. His father, her 26-year-old boyfriend, a student as well as an army veteran. The Rifkins named their bundle of joy Joel David. As happy a time as it was, Ben felt great sadness over the fact that his mother died less than a year earlier and missed meeting her first grandchild. But the family soon moved into a brand new home in Rockland County, a northern suburb of New York City. Within 2 years, they adopted a second child, a girl born to different biological parents, whom they named Jan. Rockland County was extremely rural back then, and Joel remembers leading a Mark Twain-like existence that was mostly filled with happiness. "The happiest period of my life keeps going back to Rockland County," he later explained. "The beginning of my conscious memory, when I was 4, we had a very open backyard, maybe a half an acre, surrounded by woods on both sides, across the street and behind us. So I had my frogs to play with, my tadpoles and newts, whatever crawled in the woods, that was my toy. That was before anybody really started getting abusive, so that was a great time." It was also, he recalls, the only time he ever felt like an accepted member of a group. "I remember the woods, the frog pond, and that whole bit," he said. "I remember there was this drainage ditch, and I took my troop of friends and decided to go wandering down this drainage ditch. We saw a housing development down at the other end of this drainage ditch, and we came back. We didn't know that we were gone for an hour or 2, maybe 3 hours. We had every parent in the neighborhood freaking out. I was more confident back then, I guess, and I went to nursery school with the same bunch of kids, and I didn't have that many problems." Just before Joel started kindergarten, the family moved to East Meadow on Long Island, after Ben landed a job with an architectural firm named Thompson and Zark. The move would prove to be devastating to young Joel, who still refers to the times before the move and after the move as comparative periods of great joy and immense pain in his life. "Because of my birthday, I had to wait a year to go to school," he recalled. "I didn't make the cutoff for the district, and there weren't that many kids my age. I went from having a lot of kids my age to practically none. The older kids would play stick ball out on the curb, but I didn't have the coordination to join in. The only kid my age was my direct neighbor. They let him play all the time because he happened to be an athlete. That neighbor turned out to be the single most constant reminder of everything Joel was not. He was the exact opposite of Joel in every way. He could whack a Spalding for 10 hours straight, so he was always playing with the older kids, Joel recalled. He was the athlete, I wasn't. He was socially popular, I wasn't. He played with kids in the street, which I couldn't. He was president of the school. I went to Nassau Community College, he went to Princeton. The complete opposite, total. To make matters worse, throughout their entire school career they almost always sat next to each other in homeroom, because their last names were so close in alphabetical order. Gein watched helplessly from inside the house. Joel would sit on the curb to play ball with the other kids, but they wouldn't let him play. He would then retreat upstairs and watch out the window. She desperately wanted to approach the insensitive kids and demand that they include her son in their games, but she knew that would only add to the grief he was already experiencing. How could I go to the kids and say, "Let him play," she wondered. He would never be able to live that down. As young as 6 years old, Joel would excitedly anticipate rock and fossil expeditions, where he unearthed, among other things, chalk, clay, coal, coral, sandstone, limestone, and basalt. All of these items were proudly showcased in his room, giving a visitor the impression that he wanted to be an archaeologist or a professor someday. He also loved to disperse seeds throughout the yard, as well as anything to do with fossils. At the Museum of Natural History, curiously, Joel could spell plant names in Latin, but not in English. Gein was even more ecstatic when her son developed an interest in photography. "It was thrilling for me, absolutely," she recalled. "And I used to let him use the dark room, even encouraged him to use it, and he has never been the neatest person." He had a great eye for composition and was good at so many things, but never took anything far enough. He was great at starting things, but never finishing them. I couldn't understand why. By 1967, he began taking a formal interest in photography and handcrafts. He remembers telling his first-grade teacher that he wanted to write a book, even though his dyslexia caused an array of embarrassing problems with both reading and writing. Writing was the only task he could think of that would allow him always to be alone. He began hiding himself in places where he could not be found, and developed a fantasy life that lasted well into adulthood. When Joel started kindergarten, he already felt like a misfit because of his lack of both athletic ability and self-confidence. Besides suffering from undiagnosed dyslexia that impaired his ability to read, he would often stutter when beginning to speak. His mind would wander in mid-sentence, and it was difficult for him to follow simple instructions. Although it was later determined that he had an IQ well above average, many people meeting him for the first time believed that he was mentally impaired. His feelings of inadequacy only intensified when he attracted the attention of a class bully, who he believes dramatically changed the direction of his life. "In my kindergarten class, there was one guy who would have been inside the prison system ahead of me, but he ended up dying in a motorcycle accident," said Joel. "He was completely out of control. Because of him, I then had a reputation that invited other guys to join in. If you wanted to establish your reputation as a tough guy, I was the guy you looked for. So I just created a nice little secret life for myself. I didn't hang out with other kids. I had very few friends." Causing Joel even more grief were his always growing feelings of incompetence around his father. "My father was an athlete as a child," Joel recalled. If he had the grades under today's situation, he would have been a college player in football. Those were the days when quarterbacks were more like running backs, and you played both sides. No face mask and leather helmet type stuff. He wanted to take the baseball and the football out and play with his kid in the street. "I had as much chance of catching the ball with my face as I did with my hands. I was terrible." Ben's frustration extended to math. He loved numbers almost as much as he loved sports, and was equally adept at both. He would spend hours working with his son, but eventually grew infuriated at his inability to grasp the rudiments. "It irked him that he could do these crazy math things and I could not," said Joel. These were back in the slide rule days. It took him a while to adapt to little handheld calculators, but you could give him a 9-digit series and come back to him 10 minutes later, and he'd give it back to you. He could give it back to you backwards if you wanted. He could do mathematical equations and word problems in his head. Me, I couldn't memorize a multiplication table. There would be many nights where he'd sit with me and we'd go over and over it, and he'd get frustrated and have to walk away. He finally just gave up. Ben's frustration only made Joel feel more and more like a colossal disappointment, the disenfranchised son of a man he perceived to be a genius. Neither parent ever slapped Joel with the burden of being adopted, and they always thought of him as their son. They did not even tell him he was adopted until he was 11 years old. Ben went to the school and talked to the principals and administrators, but as Joel recalled, the 60s really weren't set up for children with special needs. There would be a special classroom for grades 6 through 12 for what were called the oddballs. Gein noticed that Joel was unable to interpret the facial expressions and body language of others. He never seemed to be aware that people were angry or annoyed with him, she said. He would do anything for attention, even if it was negative attention. In the early 70s, Ben was the vice president of the East Meadow School Board, as well as a trustee of the town's public library, where a sunlit atrium is dedicated to him. Joel saw his father as a mountain of a man who could hold his own in any physical, social, or intellectual arena. He could walk into a room and light it up, he recalled. He was very gregarious, I guess that's the word, always giving big hugs and pats on the back. One of the things Joel always admired about Ben was his refusal to glorify violence, even though he experienced plenty of it during World War II. While many of Ben's more macho friends regularly regaled an impressionable Joel with tales of bloodshed on the battlefield, Joel worshipped his father for not trying to get mileage out of his days as a foot soldier in the European theatre. I know guys who were World War II veterans who would go to the VFW, sit around, kick back, and tell stories of the war like that was the only time they felt alive, said Joel. And Dad would never talk about the war. Even as a kid, I would say, "Daddy, tell me a story." His war stories were all non-combat stories. He never told me about all the kids he saw getting blown up. Ben's favorite story was the one when he, a sergeant, and his driver were going through a short tunnel when they encountered another vehicle coming in the opposite direction. As they crossed paths, the occupants of both jeeps, one German, one American, realized they had just passed the enemy. They all did double takes and kept going. No one became a hero and turned around and chased. Although Joel's parents were well aware of his adjustment problems, they were oblivious of the degree of abuse their son endured at the hands of others. Gein remembers only one time when Joel came home from elementary school visibly upset. He was in the 4th or 5th grade. He was red in the face and said he had been waylaid on the way home, she recalled. The kids pulled his underwear off. My husband wanted to go to the school, but Joel begged him not to. My husband took care of it by talking to the parents of the bullies, and that group never bothered Joel again. While that group might not have bothered him again, there were plenty of others to take their place. Joel devised a strategy to avoid his confrontational classmates, but it only sent him deeper into his own little world. The building formed an H, and there were 2 entrances with a walkway across, he said. We had to line up, and our line went this way, and the older kids' line went that way. I used to be terrified to get on the line, so I used to time it, so I would walk up the block as everyone was going in. I'd get later and later, then start walking in a few minutes late. Although now safe from his tormentors for at least a few hours, he would immediately begin worrying about how to get home safely. In grade school there is not much to do, but I would clean the fish tank in the principal's office, clean the erasers, whatever, staying in the school long after all the other students went home. Joel also tried to compensate for being such a social and athletic failure by choosing to stand out in his own way. Now kids use backpacks. I started out with my grandfather's backpack. It started to fall apart, so I switched to a suitcase of all stupid things. I'm walking around with a little brown and tan suitcase. He ran for student body vice president in junior high school. I guess I wanted attention. I mean, the whole election was a popularity contest. I think I got 20 votes or something like that. He also took elective violin lessons, even though drums were all the rage. Here I am walking around with a violin case, and you just don't walk around as a guy with a violin case in school if you don't want to attract all the bullies of the world, he said. At that stage of his life, Joel differed greatly from his sister Jan, who was much more socially adjusted, had a good group of emotionally healthy friends, and according to her mother, was more adept at gauging other people's feelings towards her. He was a very shy child, fairly awkward around other children, and from the moment he enrolled in school, Rifkin's life became one of constant teasing, bullying, and abuse by his peers. Upon Rifkin's attendance at East Meadow High School, things deteriorated even further. His grades were terrible, which his father found embarrassing, and Ben apparently yelled at Rifkin, asking him why he couldn't do anything to please his father. His mother, Gein, was fairly oblivious to the bullying Rifkin had been suffering, and believed he was just a bit of a loner. Already a target for bullies, Rifkin's own attire and manner made him even more of a soft touch at high school. He looked like the typical nerd of that era, with his pants pulled up high, his white socks showing above his shoes, and his glasses. One of the people who bullied Rifkin later referred to him as an abuse unit. That although he didn't do anything to bring about the unwanted attention, his sheer presence seemed to annoy people. Joel joined the track team in high school and hoped that by doing so he could erase many of his past humiliations, as well as garner some much-desired appreciation from his father and his peers. "I learned if you fought back, you got beaten worse," he said. "I'd take the public pummeling and go down. The guy would be satisfied, his manhood intact. I knew who my enemies were because they were all on the track team. If you join a gang, then no one else can touch you." Things started off fine, and Joel enjoyed what he thought was a brief period of comfort and camaraderie among his teammates. But it did not take long for things to deteriorate. Getting his head dunked into a toilet bowl or a dead chicken stuffed in his mouth were just some of the things he endured. At one point he developed what he thought was a mutually caring relationship with a sensitive female teammate. Her older brother, the star of the team, did not share his sister's sensitivity and decided to have a little fun at Joel's expense. "I stopped by the house to pick her up once," he recalled. Big brother decides to do the old check out the boyfriend routine, even though he knows me from the team. So while he is asking 21 questions, he is cleaning a shotgun. He is rubbing it and brushing it, the whole bit. Joel gulped hard when the boy said, "Don't hurt my sister," as he clicked and pumped the weapon. I was like, "Gee, nice and subtle message," recounted Joel laughingly, although he is the first to admit he wasn't laughing at the time. Once the rest of the team got wind of the relationship, the games really began. One day, Joel was working hard at his part-time job at the public library and was eagerly looking forward to meeting his girlfriend afterward. Shortly before the end of his shift, a group of teammates armed with eggs and shaving cream converged on the building and immediately blocked all the exits. Like a cornered rabbit, his heart beating wildly, his eyes dashing furtively about, he realized he had to make a quick decision. He chose to call his father. "I decided to just have Dad pick me up, which was like a big sissy mistake," he said, as if still shouldering the ignominy of the experience a quarter of a century later. What was even more hurtful than the incident itself was the fact that his girlfriend, urged on by the crowd, was laughing heartily along with them. I don't know if the whole thing with her from the beginning, day one, was a setup, or if it developed later on, he said. His tormentors also filled his gym bag with eggs and shaving cream before he left. His father, having witnessed so many similar occurrences, was unmoved. By that time it was normal, said Joel. He gave up trying. In grade school, up until a little of junior high school, he used to want to know who the kid was, and he would go talk to the father. A couple of times it would help, but mostly it would encourage it. The nickname Joel the Turtle stuck through those years, given largely because of the unusual way he walked with a sloping posture and his slow pace. He was also taunted on the track team with a new nickname, Lard Ass. This also led to him being excluded from participating in sports because none of his peers wanted to choose him for their team. He never did anything to warrant the attacks, they just selected him as the target of their nastiness. He suffered daily the brunt of horribly sadistic pranks and jokes, and regularly had his books and lunch stolen. There was also a locker incident during winter track season. Teammates were running in the building when they pinned Joel against a girl's locker he had a schoolboy crush on. One of the shot putters held him against it, and they take out this big, huge 1-inch magic marker, the graffiti type, and just covered the whole thing with her name, my name. A lot of 4-letter words. A lot of basic sexual remarks, said Rifkin. After practice ended, a mortified Joel located a custodian who supplied him with a foam cleaner that removed all the graffiti. He then found her number in the phone book and called her at home. I said I just wanted to let you know, in case they come in early and do something. I was seriously mad, and it takes a lot to get me mad. The girl thanked him for calling and told him things were still okay between them. What followed surprised him even more. I went on a little hunting party the next couple of days, he remembered. Basically, I found some of the guys who had done it, and we got into a yelling match, and a couple of them got pushed up against lockers. I basically said, you guys might be able to knock me out, hospitalize me, but I am going to hurt you. After that, he quit the track team and retreated back into his self-imposed isolation. It was like the only time I did something like that, where I took an affirmative, defensive step, he said. At a teenage leadership retreat at summer camp, he took advantage of the fact that nobody knew his personal history, and began boasting about how easy it was to ask someone for a date. Before he knew it, he found himself dared into doing just that. Much to his surprise, the girl happily agreed, and the two went to see a movie. Then they planned to attend a party for their second date. While riding their bicycles to the party, Joel, thinking a setup awaited him, began to panic. Terrified of being humiliated in front of a girl he actually liked, he adamantly refused to attend, even though they pedaled to within yards of the house. He painstakingly told her about the bet, but to this day does not know whether it was a setup or not, because he never mustered enough courage to go inside the house. She thought the whole date was a setup to use her, he recalled. She took it very badly, and I had no idea how to deal with it. At a party during the school year, he downed a few beers in order to loosen up and fit in. I make the mistake of telling the truth. There was this girl who was in all of the school plays. I sat in the row behind her in biology class, and I had this basic schoolboy crush on the girl, and she knew it. But she was dating some guy from a different school, so we just talked. I took her picture a few times for the yearbook, that kind of thing. That was the same girl whose locker became the target. On his first date, Joel arranged to go out with the girl in the track team, but the eggs and shaving foam incident happened. The second time Rifkin tried to go on a date, the bullies found them at a pizza parlor and chased them both down the street until Rifkin and his date were able to hide in the local library. By the time he started college, Rifkin had not maintained a relationship, much less asked anyone to be his girlfriend, or experienced a real romance. During his senior year, as a member of the yearbook committee, Joel was put in charge of taking most of the photos for the book. Gein was thrilled for him because she believed he might finally garner acceptance from his classmates. He took his job much more seriously than most of the other committee members and worked long hours taking snapshots, developing the film, and laying out the pages. When the book was finally brought in on schedule, because of Joel's efforts more than anyone else's, his fellow workers did not even invite him to the wrap party. Once again, he was the odd man out. He was just devastated. Absolutely devastated, said Gein. He was almost single-handedly responsible for that book being out on time, and they just dismissed him. He was always able to hide his pain in the past, but he couldn't hide the pain from that incident. He was heartbroken, and so was I. He graduated in 1977 at the bottom of the class, but he hoped that life would get better once he went to college. Because of his array of learning disabilities, Joel's grades were average at best, which caused a rift with his father over what educational path he would take. "Dad wanted me to go to community college," said Joel. "He was like, 'We will knock out the basic credits you need as cheaply as possible, and after a year or two there you will go somewhere else.' And he was firm on this." Every other kid is filling out applications to Brown and Stanford. They had these lists of colleges, and I had done no college research at all. Joel dutifully, but miserably, went off to Nassau Community College, feeling as much like an outcast as he always had. It was located just a few miles from his home, and it was not the place to reinvent himself. If you want to meet people and have a group of friends, community college is not the place to go, he explained. The period ends and the parking lot empties. There is no college life at all. Like so many of the other unfinished projects that would in many ways define him, Joel completed only one course at Nassau. That failure was only exacerbated by the forward strides his father made during the same period. Ben left his longtime employer to take a more prestigious, higher-paying position as a structural engineer at a national laboratory headquartered on Long Island. In the months prior to his departure for Brockport, Joel began patronizing prostitutes in Hempstead, a run-down town not far from his home, because he was determined to acquire sexual experience before arriving at college. Thinking everyone else his age had it, he didn't want to be known as the only virgin in the dormitory. For $20 he could speak to any woman he wanted, with no fear whatsoever of rejection. "The whole idea is, it's an assembly line," he explained. "There's no foreplay, it's get it over with as fast as we can, push all the right buttons, get him out of here in 2 minutes flat." It almost becomes habitual. In the fall of 1978, he transferred to SUNY Brockport, the State University of New York at Brockport, a suburb of Rochester. He joined the photography club and became a highly respected member of it. It was there, on October 26, 1979, that he was introduced to Robert Mladinich, a 22-year-old junior who just landed his first paying writing gig with a national boxing magazine called Hank Kaplan's Worldwide Boxing Digest. Mladinich needed a photographer to cover Rocky Fratto, an undefeated junior middleweight fighting at the Monroe County Dome Arena in Rochester, and raced to the school's journalism department for help. Within an hour, he was introduced to a rumpled, shaggy and bespectacled transfer student who whiled away most of his days in the well-equipped photography lab. Joel had equally ambitious dreams of being a photojournalist and was as thrilled as Mladinich was to get a jump start on his career. During the 30-minute drive to Rochester, the two quickly realized they had much in common. Although neither was particularly athletic, they were attending a school known most for its athletic excellence. They both hailed from Long Island, and were both quintessential loners who had long ago escaped into solitary pursuits. Joel's being photography, Mladenich's being writing. Joel shared his hopes of taking up skydiving so he could make a living chronicling parachutists as they made their thrilling descents. Joel Rifkin and I could not have gotten along better, Mladenich wrote. The fight ended in a disputed decision, and the arena erupted. Chairs were 6 deep in the ring, fistfights broke out across the building. Joel initially sought refuge under the ring, but quickly realized that from a journalistic standpoint, valor took precedence over safety. He was soon amid the fray, firing away with his camera like a frontline war correspondent. After trying to hustle some of Joel's photos into the city's 2 daily newspapers, they headed back to Brockport in the wee hours of the morning, intoxicated by adrenaline and talking non-stop. Judging by the half-smile that never left Joel's face, it was obvious that he was equally charged, not only by his immense grace under fire, but by the respect I was according him as a colleague, Mladenich recalled. In the photography club, Joel's work earned genuine praise. I had professors, I had professionals tell me, this one's pretty good, the rest of them you can chuck. But yeah, you have an eye here, he said. He recalled a particular photograph taken at Brockport, a guy sunbathing leaning back on his skateboard, and the way the sweat and musculature was. It was a heck of a photo. I took it from above, and there were all these little patterns around him, but he couldn't accept the compliments. I always underrated my skills. I didn't have that self-esteem to say, yeah, I'm a good photographer. He became serious enough with a girl at Brockport to move in with her, but the relationship fell apart. I was basically seriously depressed by that time, he recalls. Medication probably would have helped me out in the world, but it wasn't around 20 years ago. The apartment looked like a tornado, and she got tired of living that way. I was sleeping all the time, just not functioning. She said, if you don't pass your subjects, if you don't get it together, I am going to rethink this whole relationship. What his girlfriend did not know was that Joel was leading a clandestine life, regularly traveling to Rochester to be with prostitutes. Going out on the streets was my little secret world, he recounted. That world never mixed with my normal everyday world unless I needed money and had to steal from the regular world to pay a bill, or if I was late for work. Their sex life also collapsed. I performed a little too fast, he recalled. I didn't realize it at the time, but patronizing prostitutes became a problem in my personal encounters. She was in an amorous mood one night, and she was looking for a night of romance, and I was Mr. Automatic. She never spoke to me about it, I found out later on. But that basically ended our sex life. It ended the relationship pretty much too. One particularly awkward incident with his Brockport girlfriend still resonated with him. We had gone to the mall and found one of these little antique fairs where people set up little card tables, and it is almost like a garage sale, he explained. We were walking around looking at some of the stuff, and there was this old photo of Teddy Roosevelt. I haggled the guy down to $16. I bought it and didn't think nothing of it. And she took it as we are low on money and we can't make the rent. How dare you spend $16 on this piece of garbage? So we had a little argument over that. And I'm sitting there, having just got money sent up from Mom and Dad to pay the rent, but knowing I had blown $35-40 the previous weekend on one of my little wanderings. He also suffered from recurring herpes attacks throughout his time at Brockport. Over the Brockport time, I'd get dime-sized and nickel-sized lesions that were incredibly painful, he recalled. I used to get them in the back of my throat, couldn't swallow. I would be drooling for 3 days, banked 104-degree temperature. Eventually I found a doctor in Brockport who treated the infection with penicillin and Tylenol with codeine. So I'd be asleep for 3 days, basically. He dropped out of college in 1980 and returned home. He had just broken up with his girlfriend, and it was career time. So he joined up with the parent company of Record World and worked in the warehouse for a little over a year. Then he went into the management training program. The Record World job brought its own torments. They didn't promote him on their own, he asked for it. The idea was simple: go from assistant manager to manager, maybe to district supervisor, maybe transfer to another company. But he liked retail. The only thing that got in the way was doing the paperwork, a simple little daily report he couldn't handle. He had supervisors come in to work with him, had extra sessions with managers, sessions with his father, and still could not get the accounting skills to do the paperwork. Closing the store at night was its own particular terror. There are a few nights I remember that very bad feeling when they're turning off the lights, and we were in the exact middle of the circuit board. So the lights would race at you from the two sides, and at a point there was total darkness, and I'd be sitting there with the bank deposit bag and the safe open, watching the lights race toward me. Throwing everything in the safe, kicking it, spinning it, then running through the store with the lights out, because I was that late trying to do the bags. He then caught an employee stealing albums, wrote him up, only to be overruled by the union. An 18-year-old kid had more power than he had. That was the first real hard failure. He was getting physically ill. He believed he was having angina attacks. Eventually, he got fired for abuse of his own employee discount, having bought albums for a friend at Christmas. Joel moved back with his parents and returned to Nassau Community College, but his pattern of cutting classes continued, and he was seldom there. He left for the last time in 1984. Out of school, Rifkin worked a variety of jobs, but didn't last very long at any of them. Similar to college, he was constantly absent from work, his hygiene levels were poor, and he seemed inept at doing the simplest of tasks. One former employer even claimed Rifkin couldn't count to 10. When he wasn't working, he daydreamed a lot about one day becoming a poet or a famous writer, but any attempts to write always resulted in bleak or dark content. He moved out several times, but always returned to his parents' home when he lost a job. Throughout the early to mid-80s, Joel was perpetually unemployed and constantly at odds with his father. What little money he was able to sporadically scrape together doing odd jobs was spent on his regular forays into the streets. He also worked occasionally on an autobiographical screenplay called The Frosh, which chronicled his days as a freshman at Brockport. It was while immersed in that project that he met a woman named Catherine Mary Kelty. Joel says he met her on the East 12th Street stroll, but she told police they met in a Queen's pizzeria where she was working as a waitress. He passed himself off as a New York University student who just completed a screenplay. Kelty, who was about a decade older than Joel, fancied herself a writer and claimed she hired him to assist in a screenplay she was working on. Joel soon moved into the squalid West 49th Street apartment she was already sharing with another person. I spent about a month and a half there, he recalled. The guy who had it, his father passed away, and he moved in and didn't tell the landlord. I don't know if he was paying rent on it or not. The place was a general mess. The plumbing was always overflowing. Things got progressively worse when Kelty, whom he described as a prostitute and heavy drug user, became consumed by paranoia. I don't know if it was a real event or cocaine paranoia, but she thought that there was a dealer on the streets that was trying to kill her, he recalled. And I had to help her move, so I showed up one day with a car that I borrowed and moved her from this one squat to another squat. And then she wanted to know if I could hang out and follow her on her strolls, in case this guy showed up so I could at least scare him off by being a witness. She had a book of regulars and a ritual. New cheap stockings and a pint of Southern Comfort or Jack Daniels before going out every night. Although they had sex only once, right after their initial meeting, Joel had a strong crush on her. Things came to a halt for good after she stole a camera and over $2,000 in cash from his boot. She had to pay off a debt, and she was in the con where she was going to get out of town and go someplace else. And she did it real sweet, where I thought I had lost it, but she lifted it. When her photo was found in his room after his arrest, investigators were certain she was another yet-to-be-identified victim. She was tracked to a motel in Toms River, New Jersey. She said she fired him as her writing assistant because he wasn't doing anything, he was just sitting around. I couldn't stand to be around him. By that point in his life, Joel had a handful of childhood East Meadow friends with whom he played weekly games of pinochle and bridge right up until shortly before his arrest. Many of Joel's most normal and happy memories are of those times. Amazingly, Joel was able to walk on a high wire between both worlds without ever falling off. They would be as shocked as everyone else when it was later discovered what he had done. Some of the dating was after the card games, he admitted. As his friends got married one by one, it only deepened his sense of exclusion. I went to 2 of these weddings, and I got stress illness at both of them, he said. Not so bad at the first one, but at the second one, feverish. I couldn't move that day. I had 103 fever. Joel said that medication might have brought him out of his shell, but being such a loner, he couldn't bear the thought of seeking professional help. His parents brought him to a psychiatrist as a teenager, a memory he still found troubling. It's really hard to accept that you have a mental problem, he said. It's like, no, I don't have a problem. I'm just fine. I'm normal. A lot of the social anxiety disorder is not wanting to go to a psychiatrist either, because you just relate to him as another stranger. In the fall of 1986, Rifkin's father, Benjamin, was already suffering from emphysema when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Ben had an experimental chemotherapy pump affixed to his belt, through which medication flowed throughout the day. Joel would come home one Thursday night a week to lend moral support. Thursday night had a really intense TV lineup, and him and my mom would like to watch it from almost 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, he recalled. So I would join them and spend the night with them, just to be with him, trying to be close. Unfortunately, as his illness progressed, I'd give him a hug goodbye, but he wouldn't hug back. His arms would just stay limp. Ben persuaded Joel, then 28, to take one class at the nearby State University of New York, at Farmingdale. He promised to pay for a full-time curriculum the following semester if Joel earned a B or better. I picked biology because biology was hard, but it wasn't as hard as math, Joel explained. We wanted a true test. I couldn't take reading or writing. I couldn't take art. It had to be a true test. This was the agreement, and I'm working like a fiend. I'm really stressing out and concentrating. Just before the midterm exam, Ben took a lethal combination of barbiturates, fell into a coma, and died 3 days later in February 1987. Joel received his grade, a 90, on the day before his father's death. The doctor said, "We think people can hear in a coma, so why don't you tell him how you did?" he recalled. I said, "Gee, Dad, I got a 90. Isn't that great?" I still don't know if I drove him to an early death or if he was just tired of all the suffering. At the funeral, Joel's stirring eulogy began with the words, "My father didn't give me life, but he gave me love." Those words brought the mourners to tears. But other, more pervasive feelings were working hard to counteract his grief. Knowing how proud his father always wanted to be of his only son, and what a bitter disappointment he actually became, caused Joel incredible heartache. Many emotional issues were left in tatters by his father's death, and Joel spiraled into an emotional abyss, as the Mladinich source records it. The following year, Rifkin attended the State College of Technology in New York to study a 2-year horticulture program. Incredibly, he earned straight A's for 2 semesters. which resulted in him being chosen for an internship at Planting Fields Arboretum, located in Oyster Bay. It was a huge honor for Rifkin to be selected for the internship, and he was even more delighted to discover one of the other interns was a pretty blonde girl. He was attracted to her and would shadow her whenever he could, but he wasn't brave enough to ask her out on a date. In his mind, though, they were engaged in a fantasy affair. Rifkin became hugely frustrated when she showed no signs of being interested in him. On August 22, 1987, in between his father's illness and the horticulture program, Rifkin made the mistake of trying to solicit sex from the wrong woman. She turned out to be an undercover police officer, and he was arrested and fined. He was able to hide his arrest from his mother, and decided he would have to go further afield to pick up prostitutes so she would never know what he was up to. By that time, Joel's proclivity for prostitutes evolved into a full-blown compulsion. "I couldn't put 2 nickels together," he recalled. "I took a paycheck, and if I didn't pre-spend it, it would be gone by Monday. The whole focus of my life was the streets." He was ripped off at least a dozen times by different girls. Once, at the Hempstead Motel, a girl delayed proceedings until a knock came at the door. It flew open, and a man claiming to be her boyfriend grabbed her and pulled her from the room, along with Joel's money. "It was a timing thing," he said. "Now I understand why the delay." Another time on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, 2 men claiming to be cops told him a girl said he had stolen $50 from her. He gave them $30 and they drove off. The same girl ripped him off twice using the same play, telling him she lived with her grandmother and pretending to go inside, then disappearing through the backyard. Both times, 6 months apart, she disappeared into the house and through the backyard. "I don't even know if she lived in that house," he said. But in the end, it was Joel who used his meek appearance and frazzled, harmless demeanor to pull off the ultimate con of all. His reign of terror began in March 1989. 2 years to the month after his father's death, he moved back in with his mother, who at the time was whitewater rafting in Colorado. His sister was living away from home. On the night of his inaugural killing, things started out in typical fashion for him. Joel left Long Island around 10 o'clock after watching an episode of Kojak on television. He headed into the city, as he had hundreds of times before, and murderous thoughts were dancing around in his head. He had no reason to think that this would be the night he would finally cross the line from fantasy into reality. He often thought about bringing prostitutes back home, but rarely had the chance. But this night was different. Still, he insists to this day that getting his first victim in the house was in no way part of a grander scheme to lure her to some private killing ground. Because he was perpetually nervous, easily spooked, and terrified of altering his life in any way, the thought of engaging in such a dangerous action was inconceivable to him. After all, by that time he estimates he had been with well over 300 sex workers, all of whom had been paid in full and left unharmed. While Rifkin did strangle most of his later victims, his very first victim, Heidi Bulch, whom he knew as Susie, was actually bludgeoned to death with a decommissioned military howitzer shell that he purchased at a flea market before he dismembered her. That strangulation fantasy was used to sometimes jazz the evening up just on a mental level, he said. "I'd been with a long string of streetwalkers, so there were even fantasy games just to perk that up, because even that got to be routine." When Rifkin was pulled over in June 1993 for a missing license plate, police discovered the body of his final victim, Tiffany Bresciani, in the back of his truck. Once in custody, Rifkin did not try to claim innocence or pin it on anyone else. During his initial interrogation, he immediately admitted to killing 17 women between 1989 and 1993. Joel the Turtle messed up for the last time, and thank God his father wasn't around anymore to witness it. It would have been a sad scene.